Pacific Northwest is a land where mist drapes itself over moss-draped trees, rivers carve deep into ancient valleys, and shadows linger longer than seems natural. Hidden within this verdant expanse are groves that have borne witness to unexplained phenomena, strange disappearances, and lingering whispers of misfortune, the histories woven into the very soil and bark. Some forests seem untouched by time, yet carry a weight that unsettles even the most seasoned explorers, hinting at forces both subtle and inexplicable that have shaped human experience in ways science cannot fully explain. Through the dense undergrowth and silent canopies, you will follow the paths once walked by early settlers, rangers, and researchers, tracing the locations where sound fades, time distorts, and ordinary perception falters. Each grove tells a story of the uncanny, a place where natural beauty intersects with mystery, and where the line between history and legend becomes indistinct, leaving a lingering sense that the forests themselves are watching. The grove where the Tillamook burn never healed. The first time the Tillamook burn is usually mentioned, it appears as a historical catastrophe rather than a lingering mystery, a series of massive wildfires that swept through Oregon's Coast Range between 1933 and 1951 and reshaped public understanding of forest management. Yet within Tillamook State Forest, there exists a particular grove that never followed the expected arc of destruction and recovery, a pocket of land where regeneration stalled in ways that continue to trouble foresters and unsettle those who pass through it. The fires burned hot enough to sterilize soil across thousands of acres, but this grove's condition suggests something more selective and unresolved. Its presence is not marked on tourist maps, and it is rarely discussed outside internal reports and quiet local knowledge. The Tillamook burn itself began in August 1933, ignited by logging debris during an unusually dry summer, and it was followed by additional major fires in 1939, 1945, and 1951 that collectively scorched nearly 355,000 acres. These fires killed an estimated 86 people and destroyed entire communities, leaving behind a landscape of blackened snags that came to symbolize ecological devastation in the Pacific Northwest. Reforestation efforts later became a national model, with millions of seedlings planted and aerial seeding campaigns launched to restore the land. Most of the forest responded as expected, gradually returning to dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock. The grove in question, however, resisted these efforts with quiet persistence. Forestry surveys conducted in the decades after the final fire recorded uneven regrowth across the burn zone, but this grove stood out for reasons that could not be easily categorized. Soil samples taken nearby showed adequate nutrient levels, rainfall matched surrounding areas, and there were no obvious geological faults to explain the absence of mature trees. Saplings planted there often sprouted, only to wither within a few years without signs of disease or insect infestation. What remained was a stand of stunted growth interspersed with older trees that bore fire scars yet refused to die, their survival creating an unnatural contrast against the barren ground beneath them. The data acknowledged the anomaly without offering conclusions. Long before modern surveys attempted to quantify the damage, the Coast Range was already regarded with caution by both indigenous communities and early settlers. The area now known as Tillamook State Forest lies within the traditional territories of several native groups, including the Tillamook and Tlaxcani peoples, who understood the forests as places of abundance but also of boundaries. Oral traditions spoke of areas that demanded respect and restraint, though specific locations were rarely recorded in ways that translated cleanly into Western mapping systems. While no surviving records directly name this grove, its position aligns with zones historically treated as liminal rather than communal. The silence surrounding it is consistent with how such places were often handled. During the early 20th century, logging camps operated aggressively throughout the Coast Range, yet even hardened timber crews left notes in company records about tracts that were consistently avoided. In correspondence archived by Oregon's Forestry Department, there are references to sections of the burn area where equipment failures and unexplained accidents occurred at disproportionate rates. One memo from the late 1940s describes a site where replanting crews refused to work beyond a certain boundary, citing an indefinable sense of pressure and disorientation rather than any observable hazard. The description is vague, but the coordinates match the same grove that continues to resist regeneration decades later. Environmental explanations have been proposed repeatedly, often focusing on the extreme heat generated by the multiple fires and the possibility of deep soil damage. Scientists have noted that the Tillamook fires burned with unusual intensity due to accumulated slash from early logging practices, creating conditions that fundamentally altered some soil layers. Yet even these explanations fall short when applied to this grove, where adjacent land recovered normally despite experiencing similar temperatures and exposure. Satellite imagery shows a persistent discoloration in the canopy pattern, subtle but consistent across decades, suggesting a stable anomaly rather than a transitional phase. The forest appears to recognize the boundary, even if people cannot explain it. Visitors who wander into the grove often report a sudden change in sensory perception, though these accounts are usually shared quietly rather than formally documented. The dense understory typical of coast range forests thins abruptly, and the ground becomes unusually compacted, muffling footsteps in a way that feels unnatural for such a wet environment. Sound seems to carry differently, with voices flattening and echoing strangely, despite the absence of cliffs or rock faces. These experiences are subjective, but their consistency across unrelated accounts has kept the grove in the margins of official attention rather than dismissing it outright. The forest feels intact yet withheld. Wildlife behaviour adds another layer to the unease surrounding the site. Biologists monitoring elk and deer movement in the Tillamook State Forest have observed migration paths that arc around this grove with surprising precision. Trail cameras placed nearby frequently capture animals stopping at the edge of the area before turning away, even when forage appears similar on both sides of the boundary. Bird activity drops sharply within the grove, with fewer nesting sites and an absence of the constant background calls typical of Oregon's coastal forests. These patterns are difficult to attribute to coincidence alone, yet they remain resistant to definitive interpretation. Fire itself has returned to the region in smaller, more manageable events, but the grove's reaction remains distinct. Controlled burns conducted as part of forest management plans often fail to carry through the area, extinguishing themselves without clear cause. Firefighters have noted dampness in the soil that does not correspond to rainfall data, as well as wind behaviour that shifts unpredictably near the grove's interior. These observations are recorded cautiously, framed as operational anomalies rather than something more unsettling. Still, the implication is difficult to ignore, especially in a landscape defined by its history with fire. Over time, the grove has developed a quiet reputation among locals who work or live near the forest, passed along without dramatisation. It is described not as a place of overt danger, but as one of refusal, a section of land that does not respond as expected and does not welcome prolonged presence. Hikers who stumble into it often leave sooner than planned, unable to articulate why their sense of orientation feels compromised. There are no warning signs or official closures, only an unspoken understanding reinforced by experience. The forest does not need legends to enforce its boundaries. Nearly a century after the first flames of the Tillamook burn, this grove remains an unresolved fragment within a largely successful recovery story, an exception that challenges assumptions about resilience and control. Its continued resistance to regrowth, wildlife habitation, and even fire suggests a stability that runs counter to ecological models built on disturbance and renewal. Whether the explanation lies in an unrecognised environmental factor, or something less measurable, the grove stands as a reminder that not all scars fade according to plan. Some remain open in ways that refuse classification, quietly shaping the land around them. And deep within the green expanse of Tillamook State Forest, that grove continues to stand unchanged, as though the fires never truly left, and the forest itself chose not to heal there. The Skagit River Grove marked by repeating disappearances. The Skagit River does not announce its importance as it winds out of the North Cascades, carrying glacial runoff westward through a landscape that appears orderly, mapped, and heavily travelled. Fed by meltwater from peaks such as Mount Baker and shaped by seasonal snowpack, the river has long functioned as a reliable corridor through northern Washington, rather than an obstacle. Roads, bridges, fishing access points, and trailheads follow its course with practical confidence, reinforcing the idea that this is a controlled and understood environment. It is precisely this sense of familiarity that makes one riverside grove along its banks stand out, not for what it displays, but for what repeatedly fails to be resolved there. What draws attention to one particular riverside grove is not a single incident, but the way multiple unrelated cases gradually converge on the same stretch of forest before falling silent. Over time, search areas narrow with careful logic, probabilities recalculated as evidence accumulates, until effort settles along this bend of the river where movement seems to stop producing results. The grove does not dominate the landscape or block passage, and it offers no obvious hazards beyond those expected of riparian woodland. Yet again and again attention gathers there and then dissipates without closure, leaving behind an uncomfortable pattern rather than an answer. Search and rescue operations in Skagit County are structured around terrain analysis, time windows and probability grids that leave little room for improvisation or error. Teams rely on aerial surveys, ground searches, river patrols, and increasingly precise digital mapping to account for every accessible area. In theory, a riverside grove bordered by water, trails, and known access points should be among the easiest sections to clear. Visibility is relatively open compared to dense upland forest, and landmarks are fixed, making the repeated lack of resolution difficult to reconcile with established procedure. Along this section of the river, seasonal flooding reshapes banks and channels with a regularity that complicates reconstruction without fully erasing physical evidence. Snowmelt can swell the Skagit dramatically, carrying debris downstream and altering sediment deposits along the shore. These changes explain some loss of trace, particularly over longer timelines, but they do not account for the repeated failure to establish a clear direction of travel. Even after water levels recede and terrain stabilizes, expected indicators such as disturbed ground or displaced vegetation often remain absent. The river changes, but not in ways that clarify what happened near the grove. Long before modern trails and access points were established, this corridor functioned as a route of movement rather than a destination. Indigenous communities used the river for travel, fishing and trade, navigating its bends with intimate knowledge of seasonal behavior and environmental rhythm. Later, settlers, trappers and loggers followed similar paths, treating the forested banks as transitional space rather than a place to linger. This long history of passage suggests continuity rather than danger, reinforcing the sense that the grove's modern reputation is not rooted in ancient avoidance or inherited fear. Its mystery emerges from interruption, not legacy. The official record tells its own story through absences, where reports end abruptly and follow-up documentation never materializes. Maps show overlapping search grids that appear thorough on paper, yet fail to produce conclusions when examined in sequence. Timelines narrow to hours or even minutes, only to dissolve at the grove's edge without explanation. The language of these records remains careful and restrained, avoiding speculation while acknowledging uncertainty in measured terms. It is in what is not written, the lack of final entries or resolved outcomes, that the grove's presence becomes most apparent. Environmental explanations emerge slowly here, not as dramatic events but as subtle inconsistencies that interfere with measurement and orientation. Search teams have noted occasional GPS drift near the riverbank, small enough to dismiss individually but persistent enough to be remembered across operations. Sound behaves oddly amid the dense vegetation, with voices carrying unevenly over short distances or seeming to flatten against the water. Even light appears altered by the interplay of river reflection and canopy, reducing depth perception in ways that are difficult to quantify. None of these factors is extraordinary alone, yet together they complicate the basic act of determining where someone went. Accounts from those who have spent time searching the area tend to describe confusion in practical terms rather than fear or panic. Responders speak of covering the same ground twice without realizing it, or of feeling certain they had already cleared a section that later proved untouched. Anglers and hikers mention moments of disorientation that resolve only after leaving the grove's vicinity, often dismissing the experience as fatigue or distraction. These observations are usually offered reluctantly, framed as human error rather than environmental influence. Still, their repetition suggests that the grove interferes quietly with the continuity of thought and movement. Over time, the grove begins to feel less like the centre of these disappearances, and more like a boundary that investigations repeatedly fail to cross. Movement seems to slow there, not physically but procedurally, as if momentum dissipates once search efforts reach that point. The absence of clear exit paths or definitive endpoints reinforces this impression, leaving teams uncertain how to proceed without new information. People do not simply vanish within the trees, rather the process of tracking them loses coherence. The grove interrupts the narrative as effectively as it interrupts the direction. Forested regions across the Pacific Northwest present countless logistical challenges, yet few produce the same geographic repetition without escalation or resolution. Difficult terrain usually yields patterns of injury, miscalculation, or environmental exposure that eventually clarify what went wrong. Here, escalation never arrives, and resolution remains elusive despite familiarity and repeated scrutiny. The grove does not change in response to attention, nor does it yield to improved technology or refined methods. Its consistency becomes its most unsettling feature. Today, the grove remains open, unnamed on most maps, and outwardly unchanged despite decades of attention that never quite resolves into understanding. People continue to pass through the area without incident, reinforcing the impression that nothing is inherently wrong with the land itself. Yet, when search is narrow and certainty is required, this is where confidence falters. The grove persists as an unresolved margin within a well-documented landscape, quietly shaping outcomes without revealing how or why. Each time the search narrows to that quiet bend of the Skagit River, the certainty of direction seems to dissolve just enough for answers to slip away again. The Cedar Circle near Lake Quinault. Rain defines the Olympic rainforest so completely that randomness becomes its most reliable pattern, which is why the near-perfect cedar circle near Lake Quinault immediately feels out of place. Towering western red cedars dominate the surrounding forest, their heights and spacing normally dictated by sunlight, competition, and fallen trees. Yet here, a precise circle stretches across a gently sloping terrace, the canopy forming a continuous ring that rises uniformly above the understory. Trails of moss wind around the perimeter, but within the circle growth seems subdued, as if the land itself enforces a boundary. The grove is small in comparison to the lake's expanse, yet its geometry commands immediate notice. At first glance, the grove presents itself not as a clearing or a stand, but as a boundary traced with unusual precision. Measurements taken by ecologists indicate that the circle maintains a near-perfect diameter of roughly 50 feet, and the spacing between individual trees remains unusually consistent. The shape persists whether observed from ground level or from aerial photography, resisting the irregularities characteristic of temperate rainforest growth. Fallen limbs and young saplings skirt the outer edge without disrupting the formation, suggesting that natural disturbances have failed to penetrate its symmetry. The circle's existence is subtle, yet its order hints at forces or processes not entirely explained by standard ecology. Western red cedars do not naturally organize themselves into symmetrical formations under competitive rainforest conditions. Normally, seedlings sprout unevenly on decomposing logs or in patches where sunlight penetrates the dense canopy. Root networks intertwine, creating irregular spacing dictated by nutrient access, soil moisture, and microtopography. Even after centuries of growth, circular arrangements are extremely rare and generally smaller, resulting from localized conditions such as fungal mats or fallen logs. None of these mechanisms fully accounts for the cedar circle's uniformity, where dozens of mature trees maintain exact spacing and alignment. Botanists studying the area note this as an anomaly worth documentation, yet no conclusive explanation has emerged. Historical records surrounding Lake Quinault document habitation, travel, and conservation, but they do not describe deliberate tree placement within preserved forest land. Indigenous Quinault and Quileute peoples lived along the lake and river systems for centuries, moving seasonally and harvesting forest resources without altering the broader structure of the old-growth canopy. Early explorers and logging crews also passed through, leaving minimal permanent marks. Archaeological surveys have not identified any built structures or ceremonial sites within the grove. Even conservation records from the 20th century, which catalogue nearly every grove and stand, make no mention of this anomaly, suggesting it has quietly persisted without human attribution. Inside the circle, the forest floor behaves differently, as though growth has been carefully limited without visible intervention. Moss and ferns cover the outer perimeter densely, yet within the ring, leaf litter is thinner, and saplings appear stunted or absent. Soil moisture remains consistent with the surrounding forest, and nutrient samples indicate no clear deficiencies. Fallen needles accumulate in even layers, and roots curve subtly toward the centre in ways unusual for the species. Researchers note that this controlled interior pattern has persisted for decades, unaffected by storms, logging debris, or seasonal flooding. The space feels deliberately defined, not naturally chaotic. Reports of physical discomfort associated with the grove tend to follow a narrow and consistent range of sensations rather than dramatic reactions. Visitors occasionally describe lightheadedness, a vague pressure behind the eyes, or a sense of imbalance when standing within the circle. Hikers accustomed to old-growth terrain report that these sensations appear suddenly and dissipate when leaving the area. Park rangers acknowledge the anecdotal reports but emphasise the lack of injuries or lasting effects. The pattern, though subtle, is repeated enough across independent accounts to merit cautious notation, leaving the grove with a quiet reputation among those familiar with the Lake Quinault region. Sound behaves strangely within the circle, not through echoes or amplification, but through a subtle flattening that dulls spatial awareness. Footsteps, conversations, and bird calls carry differently than outside the ring, with low-frequency tones seemingly muted and higher frequencies dispersing unevenly. Even strong wind produces less rustling than expected among the tree crowns. These effects are not always consciously noticed, but may contribute to the unease reported by visitors. Acoustic measurements confirm minor anomalies, although they fall within normal ranges for forested environments. The combined sensory effects, however, reinforce the impression that the grove is distinct from the surrounding old-growth forest in ways not immediately explainable. Despite its distinct structure, the Cedar Circle has never been formally identified as a point of interest by park signage or official trail guides. It lies outside the main hiking routes and is accessible only via minor footpaths or cross-country travel. While Quinault rainforest tours highlight nearby old-growth giants and rare species, the circle itself is omitted from maps and brochures. Park documents do not classify it as geologically or culturally significant, likely because the anomaly is subtle and difficult to quantify without repeated measurement. Its omission has preserved its isolation, leaving the grove quietly enigmatic to anyone entering without prior knowledge. Circular growth patterns exist elsewhere in nature, yet most rely on biological mechanisms that are absent from this environment. Fairy rings of mushrooms, termite activity, or fungal mats can create apparent circles in grasslands or smaller stands of trees, but none of these processes accounts for dozens of mature cedars maintaining exact spacing across decades. No evidence of planting, pruning, or human intervention has been found, and satellite imagery shows the formation enduring through storms, landslides, and decades of seasonal flooding. The Cedar Circle remains unique in both scale and precision, a formation that defies expectation within a forest shaped by randomness. Age estimates suggest the cedars have maintained their formation for generations, resisting both encroachment and collapse. Core sampling places the trees at several centuries old, with growth rings indicating steady but slow expansion. The interior remains free of catastrophic treefall, and the circular alignment has not distorted despite natural pressures from wind or competition. This durability lends the grove an appearance of intentionality. The circle does not evolve into disorder like surrounding forested areas. Scientists studying long-term stability recognize the anomaly as rare, noting that the grove represents a persistent and measurable deviation from established growth patterns. Viewed as a whole, the grove does not appear to be evolving, spreading, or decaying in ways consistent with surrounding forest systems. It stands as a self-contained formation, neither reclaiming open space nor being reclaimed by encroaching saplings. The symmetry remains visually precise, the tree heights uniform, and the interior ecosystem subtly moderated. Visitors note the sensation of enclosure, a quiet separation from the rest of the rainforest. Biologists and ecologists alike describe the circle as a stable anomaly, enduring through centuries without a clear explanation, a deliberate exception in a landscape defined by organic unpredictability. Whatever shaped that cedar circle near Lake Quinault seems less concerned with being discovered than with remaining exactly as it is. The Rogue River Grove, avoided by early prospectors. Gold-bearing tributaries along the Rogue River drew countless prospectors in the mid-19th century, yet one dense riverside grove consistently escaped exploration and exploitation. During the height of the Oregon Gold Rush, prospectors followed every promising bend of the river, scouting potential mining sites and staking claims. Maps from the period indicate thorough coverage along the banks, with small camps and sluicing operations dotting accessible areas. Yet this particular grove remained conspicuously untouched, despite its proximity to known gold-bearing stretches. Even seasoned miners, capable of traversing difficult terrain, seemed to regard the section with a combination of caution and inexplicable avoidance. Its presence was recorded but rarely entered. Journals and newspaper accounts from early prospectors mention the area obliquely, noting its thick canopy and the disorientation travellers sometimes felt when approaching it. One diary entry from 1854 describes navigating along a narrow bank only to find the forest suddenly impenetrable, with light filtering unevenly through dense branches. Reports in local newspapers refer to an unusual stretch of timber that required detours, though the accounts never explain why the men chose avoidance over exploration. The repeated references across independent sources indicate that the reactions were not isolated, suggesting that the grove exerted a subtle influence on human behaviour. A steep riverbank above a slow meander shapes the grove, where currents twist unpredictably over jagged rocks and shifting sandbars. The river here narrows considerably, forcing travellers to negotiate both land and water simultaneously. Shallow eddies and submerged logs make footing precarious, while sudden drops in the riverbed can surprise even experienced boatmen. From above, the grove appears as a dense, unbroken wall of green that interrupts otherwise navigable terrain. While not physically impassable, the combination of river complexity and forest density creates an impression of inaccessibility that likely contributed to early prospectors' instinctive detours. Beneath towering Douglas firs and western hemlock, the soil remains unusually soft and damp, fostering an understory of ferns and moss that impedes movement more than it first appears. Fallen branches and rotting logs create natural obstacles, while moisture retains a constant chill that slows progress. Even in summer months, the forest floor can feel like a sponge underfoot, resisting quick traversal. The density of the canopy blocks direct sunlight, leaving shadows that blur depth perception. Prospectors may have interpreted these subtle environmental cues as warning signs, reinforcing the human tendency to bypass unfamiliar or uncomfortable terrain. Travellers frequently recorded hesitation, describing a subtle but pervasive unease that led them to bypass the stand entirely without explanation. Some accounts mention a sudden pause, a brief reconsideration of planned routes, and the unspoken decision to detour around the grove. Men accustomed to navigating the forest reported this sensation multiple times, as if the grove exerted a silent pressure on judgment. Their records note nothing visible that would justify alarm, yet they instinctively altered paths. Over decades, these repeated behavioural patterns created an unspoken consensus among those familiar with the Rogue River corridor. The grove was to be avoided. Even the terrain seems to conspire with this instinct, as hidden hollows, dense root mats and small pools force adjustments in route almost automatically. Slopes descend sharply into subtle depressions where water collects unpredictably, creating natural traps for footing. Roots twist across trails, forming barriers that require constant attention. Low-lying pools may form without warning, reflecting the canopy in a distorted mirror that confuses depth perception. Prospectors moving quickly or carrying heavy equipment would have found progress slowed without an obvious cause, reinforcing hesitation and reinforcing the grove's reputation as a place where ordinary navigation felt disrupted. The effect on early settlement and resource exploitation was clear, as prospectors and loggers prioritized surrounding land, where surveying and movement were straightforward. Timber operations favored areas with more open spacing between trees and gentler slopes, while claims for gold extraction targeted accessible gravel bars and tributaries. Over time, survey maps consistently left the grove unmarked or lightly annotated, and settlers' cabins or supply caches were constructed at a distance. The cumulative impact of these choices preserved the stand in a near-pristine state, creating a rare pocket of old-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock untouched by intensive human activity. Nearby forested sections of similar composition were logged or mined extensively, highlighting how unusual and consistent this particular area's avoidance was. Comparisons show that adjacent groves, separated by only a few hundred yards, underwent selective harvesting or minor prospecting, trails were cleared, and undergrowth was disrupted for transport or temporary camps. Yet the rogue grove remained a consistent gap in otherwise continuous human utilisation. The contrast emphasises that the avoidance was not incidental, but sustained across multiple decades and multiple generations of travellers, reflecting something unusual about the grove itself rather than circumstances external to it. Observers in the modern era often remark on the subtle differences in the stand, uneven footing, lingering coolness, and a slight disorientation that mirrors historical accounts. Scientists and hikers describe a sense of compression within the grove, where the air feels heavier and the river noise more distant. Light is filtered and diffused differently, and sound carries unevenly across short distances. These effects are minor, measurable only under careful observation, yet they produce the same instinctive pause reported by prospectors over a century ago. Contemporary experience reinforces the impression that this stretch of rogue river forest exerts a quiet, persistent influence over human perception. Core samples of the largest Douglas firs reveal trees centuries old, suggesting that the area's apparent inaccessibility preserved a fragment of old growth that endured beyond human impact. Growth rings indicate slow, steady development and resilience to both environmental stress and the occasional minor fire or flood. This age reinforces the grove's historical continuity, connecting the observations of early prospectors to modern ecological study. The preservation of such mature specimens, rare along an otherwise exploited river corridor, demonstrates the tangible consequences of human avoidance in shaping the survival of specific ecosystems over time. Human movement along the Rogue River seems to bend quietly around this section, as if travellers instinctively recognise boundaries that cannot be fully explained. Modern maps and hiking guides reflect this pattern, with unofficial trails diverting subtly around the stand, avoiding direct passage. Both historical and contemporary behaviour suggest an unspoken acknowledgement of the grove's authority, a recognition that is never articulated but repeatedly observed. Survey teams and conservationists note the consistency of these paths, hinting that instinct, rather than conscious decision, governs interaction with the area. The stand functions as both obstacle and guide, shaping activity in ways largely unrecorded yet undeniably persistent. The stand continues to influence those who pass near it, guiding their choices without offering any reason for its authority. The Olympic Peninsula Grove where sound vanishes. Mist drifts perpetually through the Olympic rainforest, and in one particular grove the usual chorus of flowing water and bird calls appears strangely muted. The dense canopy of Sitka spruce and western hemlock captures nearly all direct sunlight, leaving the forest floor in a soft, dim green light even in midday. Streams that wind through adjacent terrain carry the familiar rush of water, yet within the grove their sound seems subdued, as if absorbed by the mossy ground. Travellers passing through note the contrast immediately. The outside world is alive with noise, but here a quiet reigns that feels deliberate rather than incidental. Even the occasional rustle of a small mammal, which normally punctuates the forest air, seems swallowed by the dense vegetation. Early naturalists passing through the area noted that even loud footsteps seemed oddly softened, leaving a sense of quiet dissonance among the trees. Field notes from the late 19th century reference a peculiar hush in sections of the peninsula's old-growth forest, where voices and animal calls appeared less distinct. Observers could not attribute the phenomenon to wind, terrain, or tree density alone, though the dense foliage likely played a role. The recordings of naturalists highlight the consistency of the experience. Multiple parties over decades documented the same reduction in sound, establishing a pattern that hints at more than a casual environmental coincidence. Several observers also remarked on a sensation of temporal distortion, where movement through the grove seemed slightly slowed or elongated. Towering Sitka spruce and western hemlock dominate the stand, while thick moss and dense ferns carpet the floor, shaping not just the terrain but the way sound travels. Fallen branches and decayed logs litter the understory, creating soft surfaces that absorb footfalls. The arrangement of trees and the irregular spacing of massive trunks form a labyrinthine acoustic environment. Scientists note that sound waves can be deflected and scattered in such settings, yet measurements indicate a level of suppression that exceeds what would be expected from foliage alone. Even small splashes of water in hidden pools seem to vanish quickly. adding to the impression of a space that bends perception itself. Acoustic measurements in the grove reveal subtle but measurable reductions in decibel levels, with echoes disappearing more rapidly than in comparable sections of forest. Microphones and decibel meters record a consistent attenuation across a range of frequencies, from low footstep vibrations to high-pitched bird calls. Researchers conducting controlled experiments report that sounds outside the grove often fail to propagate fully within, creating a bubble of quiet. This effect persists regardless of wind direction, temperature, or humidity variations, suggesting a physical property of the grove's composition that remains largely unexplained by conventional acoustic theory. Even the slightest noises from outside seem to fade before reaching the interior, reinforcing the sense that the grove is acoustically isolated. Wildlife responds unusually. Birds pause mid-call and amphibians remain still longer than normal, as if the grove imposes an unspoken rule of silence. Observations show that species familiar with the surrounding forest hesitate when entering the area, altering flight paths or vocal patterns. The quiet seems to influence behavior as much as it affects sound transmission. Even insects and small mammals demonstrate subtle adjustments. Movement is slower, calls are less frequent, and activity is concentrated at the periphery. The pattern is consistent across multiple species, suggesting that the anomaly has a measurable effect on the ecosystem, as well as on human perception. Some researchers speculate that the density of vegetation may create a form of natural sound chamber, though this remains unverified. Hikers and forest researchers frequently report a sudden absence of familiar sounds upon entering the grove, creating a sensation of dislocation or weighty stillness. Footsteps on the mossy floor are nearly silent, while voices carried from outside seem muffled and distant. Individuals report difficulty orienting themselves due to the altered soundscape, experiencing a strange separation between visual and auditory perception. The effect is subtle, measurable only in context, but pervasive enough to leave a lasting impression on those traversing the area. Contemporary accounts echo the descriptions recorded by early naturalists, creating a centuries-long continuity of observation. Even the rustling of leaves seems delayed or muted, producing a faint echo that unsettles the senses. Wind patterns funnel differently through the trees here, and temperature and humidity gradients combine in ways that may distort acoustic waves, though no complete explanation exists. Dense clusters of evergreens redirect airflow, generating pockets of still air that act as acoustic dampeners. Moisture-laden air carries sound differently, refracting and diffusing it across short distances. The irregular topography further complicates the propagation of waves as shallow depressions and hidden ridges interrupt and scatter sound. Yet even when accounting for these factors, the magnitude of suppression remains unusual, hinting at a complex interaction of variables that science has yet to fully quantify. Measurements indicate that the grove's microclimate may amplify these effects in ways still being studied. Historically, the grove saw little settlement or logging, perhaps in part because the persistent quiet unnerved early visitors, leaving it remarkably undisturbed for centuries. Unlike adjacent tracts exploited for timber or crossed by explorers, this section remained sparsely traversed. Diaries of early settlers mention an unnatural hush that made extended exploration uncomfortable, while logging surveys note that crews often avoided dense sections entirely. The lack of human activity contributed to the preservation of the grove's old-growth character, enabling centuries-old trees to thrive and maintaining the very structure that reinforces the acoustic anomaly. Some historians suggest that repeated mentions of unease may have contributed to local oral traditions, warning travellers to steer clear. Nearby sections of old-growth forest exhibit entirely normal sound behaviour, making the anomaly in this grove all the more striking to both observers and researchers. Just a few hundred metres away, rivers roar, leaves rustle, and birds call without interruption. This contrast emphasises that the effect is localised, bound to a specific arrangement of trees, moss, and terrain. Scientists use these comparisons to isolate potential causes, conducting controlled recordings and environmental assessments, but the results consistently underline the grove's uniqueness and the persistence of its silent character. The juxtaposition creates a near uncanny impression for anyone moving between the quiet interior and the noisy perimeter. Modern studies continue to examine the acoustic behaviour using sensitive microphones and echo mapping tools, yet the grove's silent character defies simple interpretation. Researchers attempt to model sound propagation under varying conditions, yet the grove consistently demonstrates greater attenuation than expected. Even when artificially generated noises are introduced, echoes dissipate faster than in any nearby forest section. This ongoing anomaly attracts both acoustic engineers and ecologists, each intrigued by the combination of ecological preservation and sensory irregularity. Despite the tools of modern science, the grove maintains its quiet authority, resisting full measurement or comprehension. Every study seems to reinforce that human perception is subtly altered when inside the space. Even under careful observation, the grove seems to resist recording, a place where sound diminishes as if filtered through the forest itself rather than the air. Every step inside produces a muted thud. Every rustle of leaves appears subdued. Even speech loses the crispness heard just beyond the boundary. Observers describe a weightiness, the sensation that presence is being absorbed along with sound. This subtle, persistent quiet leaves the impression that the grove operates according to rules distinct from the surrounding forest, a natural enigma preserved in both ecological form and sensory experience. Even the smallest noises seem to vanish as they move inward, creating a disconcerting sense of auditory displacement. Silence hangs over the grove like a living presence, revealing nothing and letting no sound escape its reach. The Silver Falls stand where time perception breaks. Sunlight filters unevenly through the canopy near Silver Falls, and within one secluded stand, the passage of time itself seems to warp in subtle, unsettling ways. The thick undergrowth of ferns and mossy logs creates a labyrinthine floor that twists perception, making distances seem longer or shorter than they truly are. Streams wind through the grove, their flow familiar, yet observers often feel that the current of moments carries differently here. Even a brief walk can leave visitors with the sense that hours have passed when only minutes have elapsed. Every sensory cue appears slightly off, contributing to a growing sense of dislocation within the forest. Explorers and early forest rangers recorded moments where brief walks felt drawn out and hours seemed to collapse into minutes, leaving them disoriented upon leaving the grove. Diaries from the late 19th and early 20th centuries recount instances where travellers misjudged time intervals, reporting confusion over schedules and missed rendezvous points. Rangers conducting patrols similarly noted that tasks which normally required predictable durations became inconsistent within the grove. These historical accounts are notable not for exaggeration, but for their consistency, suggesting a phenomenon that repeatedly challenges human expectations of time in a localized area. Massive western red cedar and Douglas fir dominate the terrain, their dense arrangement and moss-laden branches forming corridors where perception of distance and duration appears distorted. Fallen limbs and accumulated duff-cushioned footsteps, muting sound, while shafts of light pierce the canopy sporadically, producing uneven patterns that obscure the visual rhythm of movement. Some researchers hypothesize that this combination of visual and tactile input contributes to altered temporal awareness, though no single explanation has proven sufficient. The physical presence of these trees, some centuries old, reinforces the impression that the forest itself is a participant in shaping perception. Modern hikers attempting to chronicle their journeys through the grove report that watches and devices often fail to align with their sense of elapsed time, even under controlled conditions. Participants in field studies repeatedly noted that a walk intended to last 20 minutes might feel like an hour, or conversely, that an hour could pass unnoticed. Attempts to standardize experiments with GPS tracking, step counting, and chronometers yield inconsistent subjective experiences, underscoring the depth of the grove's temporal anomaly. Observers describe a peculiar mental fatigue, a sense that the mind is being forced to reconcile conflicting sensory data with internal timekeeping. Light refracted by layered foliage, shifting shadows, and the glint of dew creates a sensory rhythm that may trick the mind into misjudging the flow of moments. Sunlight filtering through the leaves produces uneven illumination that shifts with minute changes in wind and weather. The forest floor, mottled with the dappled light, becomes a visual puzzle, challenging the brain's ability to process movement and interval. Even the distant glimmer of the nearby falls seems to alter in brightness and motion, providing cues that mislead perception. Combined, These subtle variations create a disorienting environment that influences how time is subjectively experienced. Visitors frequently retrace paths, pause unnecessarily, or overcompensate for perceived delays, as if the grove subtly interferes with the brain's internal clock. Anecdotal reports describe hikers circling familiar trails multiple times before realizing they have already passed the same landmarks. Researchers have documented these behaviors using GPS tracking, noting pauses and backtracking inconsistent with task intentions. Individuals often comment on a stretching sensation, where a short distance appears endless, while sometimes long corridors seem to collapse visually and mentally. This unpredictability fosters unease, as the forest appears to alter expectations of motion and the progression of time. Fog, rainfall, and seasonal variations alter visibility and the density of the forest, intensifying the sense that time stretches, compresses, or loops unpredictably. The grove's microclimate produces heavy moisture accumulation and low-lying mist that frequently obscures the path, while sunlight filtering through damp leaves creates shifting patches of illumination. Observers describe the fog as both disorienting and slowing, affecting perceived movement and cognition. Seasonal differences in leaf density and undergrowth thickness also contribute, producing subtle but measurable changes in how quickly individuals feel they are traversing the grove. Each visit presents a slightly altered temporal environment, reinforcing the ongoing unpredictability. Nearby forest sections behave according to normal expectations. Birds call, streams babble, and hikers' devices match their subjective sense of duration, highlighting the uniqueness of this stand. Just beyond the grove, time appears linear, consistent, and predictable. The stark contrast reinforces the anomaly, drawing attention to the localized nature of the phenomenon. Researchers use these adjacent areas as controls in comparative studies, measuring deviations in timing, pace, and perception. Despite proximity, the grove remains isolated in its effect, producing a striking cognitive dissonance for anyone who transitions between the normal forest and the temporally distorted interior. Local folklore hints at a lingering unease, with whispered warnings suggesting the grove measures visitors differently, a notion echoed in consistent anecdotal reports. While no formal legend attributes supernatural causation, oral accounts stress caution and respect for the forest. Hikers often describe a sense of stepping into another rhythm of existence, as if the grove follows an unseen temporal logic. These stories, coupled with scientific observations, create a layered narrative that blends verifiable accounts with experiential mystery. The collective memory of those who traverse the grove reinforces the perception of a place where time itself is fragile, inconsistent, and unpredictable. Researchers continue to study the grove using timing devices, environmental sensors, and observational methods, yet the temporal distortion remains largely unexplained. Controlled experiments measuring heart rate, step cadence, and elapsed time all confirm that subjective experience often deviates from measurable reality. Studies also note subtle correlations between environmental conditions and reported disorientation, but no conclusive causative factor has been identified. Despite technological advances and rigorous methodology, the grove resists full comprehension, challenging the limits of human perception and scientific interpretation simultaneously. Even after repeated visits, the grove seems to resist ordinary reckoning, leaving human perception unmoored and visitors subtly uncertain of what they have experienced. Participants report a lingering sense of displacement even after exiting the stand, describing difficulty reconciling actual elapsed time with their experience. The effect endures long enough to affect memory, sometimes leading visitors to doubt their own notes or recollections. In this way, the grove imposes a subtle cognitive imprint, bending expectation, perception, and awareness without leaving physical evidence. Each traversal leaves a residual uncertainty, a whisper of temporal anomaly embedded in the mind. Time bends within the grove as though the forest itself remembers a clock no one else can see. The Hoh Rainforest's abandoned research clearing. A narrow path through the Hoh Rainforest opens suddenly onto a clearing where the forest seems to press in on all sides, reclaiming what human hands once shaped. The sunlight filters weakly through the dense canopy, casting irregular patches across the ground, while ferns and mosses creep over abandoned foundations. Wooden platforms, once intended for research observations, now sag beneath decades of weather and neglect, and rusting instruments lean awkwardly against trees. The juxtaposition of orderly remnants and encroaching wilderness evokes a sense of unease, as though the clearing exists in a liminal space between human intention and nature's relentless reclamation. A thin mist rises from the damp soil, curling around the tree trunks and filtering the weak light into a soft, green haze, giving the clearing an almost unreal quality. Historical records indicate that researchers once maintained equipment and observation stations here, yet decades of neglect have left only skeletal frames and rusting tools as evidence of human activity. Field notes from early 20th century ecological surveys mention careful measurements of rainfall, soil composition, and canopy growth, but the stations themselves were abandoned after repeated flooding and the gradual decay of wooden infrastructure. Letters from rangers and botanists reflect frustration at the impermanence of human intervention in such a dynamic forest, noting that the clearing seemed to vanish into the surrounding green within a few short years. Archive photographs and hand-drawn maps show the meticulous layout of the research plots, now overgrown and nearly unrecognisable beneath the forest's slow reclamation. Vines curl over weathered benches and platforms, moss carpets the foundations, and young saplings pierce wooden structures, blending the remnants of human order with the relentless advance of nature. Fallen logs and accumulated detritus create a soft, uneven ground that muffles footsteps, while lichens climb the metal surfaces of abandoned measurement tools. Even pathways once used to traverse the clearing have become irregular, forcing those who enter to navigate a labyrinthine floor where familiar markers are nearly indistinguishable. Occasionally, the sound of small creatures scurrying among the decaying wood punctuates the stillness, further emphasizing how life continues in subtle, unpredictable ways. The clearing feels simultaneously familiar and alien, a space where time and human memory are gradually overwritten by ecological processes. Some plant species appear to grow in unusually precise clusters around the remnants, while certain mosses thrive disproportionately on metal surfaces, creating subtle anomalies that draw the attention of botanists and ecologists alike. Observers note that ferns often form semicircular arcs around rusted platforms, and young conifers sprout in patterns that appear oddly deliberate against the chaos of the forest floor. Soil composition in these areas differs subtly from surrounding terrain, likely influenced by decades of decaying human materials, and the forest seems to respond to its abandoned intrusions in ways that defy easy explanation. Botanists studying similar abandoned sites note that moss and lichen growth on human-made surfaces often differ in texture and colour, hinting at the unique microclimate this clearing maintains. The clearing produces a peculiar sensory environment. Footsteps seem muted, distant birdsongs echo strangely, and the smell of damp earth mixes with the tang of decaying wood in a way that is at once familiar and unsettling. Light seems to scatter unpredictably, bending around fallen trees and moss-laden logs, producing shifting patterns that challenge depth perception. Occasional gusts of wind set loose the rusting fragments of human equipment, producing sudden metallic clinks that appear eerily intentional. Even in still air, the dampness carries a faint hum of movement, the gentle sway of branches, the drip of rainwater, and the subtle rustle of unseen insects, each element conspiring to create a disorienting ambience. The overall effect is disquieting, as though the clearing communicates a subtle message about the impermanence of human presence amid the forest's enduring cycles. Explorers often report a sense of disorientation and heightened awareness, as though the forest itself is subtly influencing perception, leaving them uncertain of distance, direction, or the passage of time. Paths appear longer or shorter than they should, and landmarks sometimes feel displaced from prior visits. Compasses remain accurate, yet internal judgment of space and interval becomes unreliable. Some visitors describe a fleeting sensation of slowed time, where every step feels both deliberate and uncertain. Others feel a compressed rhythm, as though the forest accelerates awareness without affecting the physical clock, leaving a subtle, lingering confusion that persists even after leaving the clearing. Many visitors also report a curious slowing of thought, as though decision-making itself is subtly affected by the strange blend of sensory input and the forest's silent insistence. Seasonal shifts enhance the clearing's eerie character. Morning fog pools low, Afternoon light slices through dense canopy and uneven beams, and rainfall saturates the soil to produce soft, almost imperceptible sounds beneath every step. During wet periods, tiny rivulets carve paths across platforms, amplifying the sound of dripping water while masking other ambient noises. In summer, dense foliage filters sunlight in strange angles, producing a mottled green illumination that can make the familiar appear odd. During rare moments when the fog lifts completely, glimpses of the surrounding forest hills reveal the clearing's isolation, highlighting how completely it is swallowed by old-growth trees and underbrush. Each visit brings a slightly altered sensory environment, reinforcing the impression that the clearing is unpredictable and resistant to ordinary human expectations. Nearby sections of untouched forest maintain predictable environmental patterns, reinforcing the uniqueness of this small clearing, where subtle distortions of sound, light, and spatial awareness seem to cluster tightly. Outside the clearing, the forest behaves as anticipated. Birds follow their usual migratory patterns, streams flow consistently, and the moss-covered floor is traversable without disorientation. This contrast underscores how even minor human interventions in such a mature ecosystem are temporary, while the surrounding rainforest retains its predictable rhythms. The abrupt contrast makes the clearing feel like an ecological anomaly, a pocket where natural processes interact with human remnants to produce experiences that are both captivating and unsettling. Forest rangers and local guides often recount stories of lingering unease, describing a watchful quality to the clearing that persists even in the absence of human observers or overt threats. They describe subtle movements of branches that seem timed with footsteps, fleeting glimpses of wildlife behaving unusually, and a persistent sense that the clearing retains a memory of those who enter. While such reports cannot always be verified scientifically, their consistency across decades suggests that the grove exerts a subtle influence on human perception, an effect amplified by its history and continued isolation. These anecdotes often coincide with subtle environmental cues, shifting light, unexpected sounds, or an inexplicable chill, that reinforce the perception of the clearing as a place apart. Scientists monitoring the area with modern sensors and ecological tools still find the clearing retains an aura that eludes measurement, a blend of natural reclamation and psychological effect that resists quantification. Temperature, humidity, and soil composition are all recorded meticulously, yet no single environmental variable explains why visitors consistently report unease or perceptual anomalies. Acoustic sensors capture standard wildlife patterns, while motion detectors indicate predictable movement of foliage and small animals, but subjective reports of spatial and sensory disorientation remain persistent. Attempts to simulate the clearing's conditions in laboratory settings have failed to replicate the same perceptual anomalies, suggesting that the grove's effect is a product of both environment and scale. Even after careful observation, the clearing conveys a quiet defiance, as though the forest asserts its own rules and memory over the objects and structures left behind by humans. Hikers who return often notice subtle changes in landmarks or conditions, reinforcing the sense that the grove is alive with its own temporal rhythm. Footprints fade unusually quickly, platforms shift slightly over time, and light behaves inconsistently as one moves through the space. Even the air feels denser here, carrying the weight of years of growth and decay, as if each breath reminds visitors of the forest's enduring presence and quiet dominance. The clearing seems to exist according to an internal logic, one that challenges assumptions of permanence, control, and measurement. Years after the site fell silent, the clearing seems to hold its own memory, whispering the forest's secrets in ways no recorder can capture. The Mount Hood Grove burned but never charred. On the western slopes of Mount Hood, a grove emerges from the wildfire-scarred forest with an uncanny resilience, its trees showing the faintest signs of heat but no blackened bark. Sunlight filters through the dense canopy, highlighting areas of scorched undergrowth while the trunks themselves remain largely intact. Fallen branches litter the forest floor, their tips charred lightly, yet the bulk of each tree appears untouched by flame. Walking among the grove, it becomes clear that the contrast between fire-swept surroundings and this seemingly untouched stand is both stark and unsettling. The ground is uneven with decayed wood, moss and small ferns thriving amid the remains of past fires, creating a surreal, almost ethereal landscape. Records from early 20th century fire surveys indicate extensive burns across the Cascade forests, yet aerial photographs reveal this grove remains curiously intact. Official reports document wildfire progression through hundreds of acres surrounding the grove, leaving blackened trunks and scorched soil in every direction. Yet when surveyors returned to the area, maps consistently showed this stand as relatively unmarked by fire. Local newspapers from the era recount fires that raged for days, consuming neighbouring forests, while the grove itself appeared untouched. The juxtaposition of widespread devastation and the grove's apparent immunity has puzzled ecologists and forest historians for decades, raising questions about whether natural anomalies or unknown factors could have influenced the fire's behaviour. From a distance, the anomaly is subtle. Fallen branches appear scorched, the undergrowth bears the mark of fire, yet the trunks themselves seem almost untouched, defying expectation. Sunlight catches on bark that glows golden brown, unmarked by charring, while ferns and moss flourish where flames should have left only ash. Small pockets of the forest floor show evidence of heat stress on seedlings, yet young trees sprout vigorously nearby. This visual contradiction confounds expectations. What appears burned at first glance is, on closer inspection, a patchwork of survival and damage, leaving the eye unsettled and the mind searching for an explanation. It is this strange interplay of fire and survival that makes the grove feel alive in a way distinct from surrounding forests. Forest ecologists note that the soil retains unusual mineral concentrations, and species diversity within the grove is higher than in adjacent burned areas, suggesting unique ecological conditions. Measurements reveal elevated levels of certain nutrients that could enhance resilience to heat or stimulate rapid regrowth. Tree ring analysis shows irregular growth patterns consistent with exposure to intermittent heat, yet without the typical cellular damage found in burned trees. Certain fungi and mosses thrive in microclimates formed by tree spacing and canopy density, reinforcing ecological differences within the grove. These subtle deviations from expected post-fire ecology hint at a natural anomaly that has allowed this stand to persist in a condition remarkably distinct from neighbouring burned regions. Walking through the grove, the air carries faint remnants of smoke, while sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant birds, behave inconsistently, producing an almost surreal atmosphere. The forest floor, thick with moss, damp earth, and fallen debris, muffles footsteps in some areas but amplifies them in others, creating a subtle distortion of space. Occasional gusts of wind seem to pause and accelerate unpredictably, stirring leaves and scattering light in odd angles. A lingering scent of charred undergrowth blends with fresh pine, further confusing the senses. The grove challenges perception in ways that feel deliberate, as though its very composition resists easy understanding. Observers who traverse the area often describe the grove with quiet awe, noting that the stand appears unusually preserved even as the surrounding terrain bears the full effects of wildfire. Hikers remark that, while neighbouring slopes display stark black scars, the grove seems to glow with life, a pocket of resilience in an otherwise ravaged landscape. Forest guides recount a sense of tension upon entering, a subtle awareness that this patch of trees is different. Photographers attempting to capture the contrast are often struck by how difficult it is to convey the paradox in images. Light and shadow shift in ways that emphasize the grove's peculiar immunity. New growth emerges in unpredictable patterns. Saplings twist toward the sky at unusual angles, moss carpets certain patches thicker than others, and small ferns flourish where fire would have destroyed them. Fallen needles and branches form protective layers, preventing complete exposure of the soil to heat. Some ceilings appear as if shielded by invisible barriers, sprouting where conditions should have been inhospitable. Within the grove, even decaying wood supports a surprising abundance of life, with small fungi appearing in clusters that would typically be consumed by fire. These regenerative anomalies reinforce the sense that this grove exists under its own set of ecological rules. Field researchers studying the grove propose microclimate effects, natural fire breaks, or specific soil compositions as possible explanations, yet the anomalous observations continue to defy conventional expectations. Experiments measuring the heat resistance of tree bark and soil moisture have produced inconsistent results, suggesting that more than one factor may be at work. Wind patterns, terrain elevation, and forest density are considered, yet none fully accounts for the grove's selective survival. The combined influence of physical and biological factors creates an environment in which fire behaves unpredictably, leaving both human and natural observers questioning the limits of understanding. Local tribal accounts describe the grove as a place where fire respects the trees, and folklore maintains that the stand has long been considered sacred or protected. Stories passed through generations speak of elders guiding children around this area during fires, hinting at a traditional awareness of the grove's unusual resilience. These narratives do not conflict with ecological observation. Rather, they reinforce the perception that the grove has long held a special place in the landscape. The blending of science and oral history adds depth to the grove's mystery, situating it both within measurable reality and the intangible cultural memory of the region. Rainfall, wind, and animal movement interact with the grove differently. Puddles form in unusual depressions, and wildlife navigates the stand with a confidence absent from neighbouring burned areas. Birds nest in trees otherwise exposed to extreme heat, and small mammals forage on floors that would otherwise provide little cover. Insects display irregular population densities, some thriving where heat exposure should have been lethal. The combination of these factors creates an environment that appears to resist natural disturbance, leaving the grove as an ecological outlier amidst a landscape otherwise defined by destruction. Close examination of the grove reveals persistent contradictions. Evidence of fire impact exists, yet the natural order of burn and regrowth seems interrupted in ways not fully understood. Soil analysis confirms that heat reached the forest floor, yet charred bark is minimal. Tree rings document exposure to high temperatures, yet the trees remain structurally sound and physiologically robust. Each anomaly compounds the others, producing a forest stand that challenges conventional interpretation and inspires a sense of cautious wonder among those who study it. Across decades of observation, this grove refuses to conform to the rules of flame and decay, standing as an unresolved mystery on Mount Hood's slopes. The Snoqualmie Pass Grove beneath the landslide scar. A sudden shift in the soil makes every step unpredictable, yet amid this precarious terrain a cluster of trees rises with an improbable sturdiness that draws immediate attention. Fallen stones wobble underfoot, yet the trees around them remain anchored, their roots gripping fractured earth with remarkable strength. The ground, scarred from previous landslides, is jagged and uneven, yet small ferns and moss flourish in pockets between rocks. Branches lean in conflicting directions, some nearly horizontal, forming natural shelters over the disturbed soil. The air carries a faint metallic scent of exposed minerals, mixed with damp vegetation, and walking through the grove, one senses a persistent tension between fragility and resilience. Light filters unevenly through the canopy, highlighting areas of rubble while emphasizing the enduring vitality of the trees. Even as distant rocks rumble from shifting slopes, the grove stands in quiet defiance, an anomaly among the chaos of Snoqualmie Pass. Branches lean at impossible angles, and moss clings to rocks where soil has been stripped away, suggesting that some unseen force preserves life in the most unstable places. The contrast is startling. While neighbouring slopes bear only bare earth or toppled trees, this grove appears curated by a hand unseen, each sapling and trunk poised as though purposefully positioned. Small seedlings emerge from cracks in boulders, and the pattern of growth does not conform to typical post-landslide succession. It is as if the forest itself has rewritten its rules, finding stability in areas conventional ecology predicts should fail. Observers often pause to examine how life adapts here, noting subtle microtopographical advantages, yet even the most detailed study cannot fully explain the grove's persistence. Fallen boulders rest against living trunks, and fissures in the soil cradle seedlings that somehow thrive despite constant risk of collapse, forming a patchwork of life and rubble. Some trees twist over rocks as though leaning towards safety, their canopies merging with those of neighbours in an intricate lattice of survival. Moss coats both stone and root in vibrant green, softening the jaggedness of displaced earth. The forest floor, broken yet alive, hums with subtle vitality. Small insects crawl across exposed roots, while moisture gathers in fissures, providing nourishment in areas stripped of topsoil. Even among the remnants of violent geological upheaval, life continues, stubborn and deliberate. Botanists examining the grove note dense mats of moss, thriving ferns, and saplings that appear in locations where shallow, fractured soil should prevent growth entirely. Their studies reveal that certain pockets retain higher moisture content, sheltered by rock formations that absorb rainfall and release it slowly. The saplings demonstrate unusual root configurations, intertwining with stone and debris to maintain stability. Certain plant species appear in microclimates unique to the scar, thriving in ways that contrast sharply with adjacent barren slopes. Researchers emphasize that while individual factors can be measured, the totality of conditions producing this anomalous growth remains unquantifiable, leaving the grove a site of ongoing ecological curiosity. The faint scent of damp earth and disturbed soil fills the air, while wind rushing down the scar creates an uneven chorus of rustling leaves and shifting branches. Gusts behave unpredictably, funneling through gaps in the canopy, stirring fallen debris and accentuating the sense of movement in an otherwise stationary grove. Footsteps on loose soil produce soft echoes, yet sound is absorbed and redirected in ways that make direction difficult to gauge. At times, the forest seems to breathe, a subtle rhythm created by wind, soil and foliage, interacting across uneven terrain. Observers report a strange awareness in such moments, as though the grove monitors its visitors, silently reminding them of the precariousness beneath their feet. Climbers and forest guides report a weird sense of stability within the grove, despite observing sliding soil and fallen rock immediately adjacent, leaving an impression that the trees somehow hold the land together. Paths that would seem impassable appear navigable only within the grove, as if some unseen architecture of roots and rock supports movement. Hikers note that boulders, when stepped upon, feel surprisingly secure, and fallen branches form natural bridges over fissures. Even during heavy rainfall, the grove retains patches of relative dryness, and observers are struck by how wildlife moves through these areas with confidence that contrasts sharply with the instability surrounding the scar. Trunks grow at dramatic angles, leaning over boulders or sloped earth, yet they maintain a striking vigour, their roots twisting and knotting into the fractured substrate. Each tree seems to follow an individual path to stability, balancing itself across rocks, fissures and neighbouring trunks. Some appear to defy gravity entirely, leaning at angles that would topple ordinary trees. Branches interlace to form a network that shields saplings from debris and wind, creating a self-supporting lattice of life. The grove's architecture seems intuitive rather than random, a natural adaptation that magnifies the tension between instability and persistence. Drainage channels and hidden rock formations appear to shield certain sections of the grove, but no combination of known factors fully accounts for its survival. Water trickles through fissures, nourishing plants while preventing soil erosion in critical areas, yet other exposed slopes with similar features fail to support equivalent growth. Rock patterns channel energy from minor slides, diverting debris away from the densest parts of the grove. Soil analysis reveals micro-variations in texture and density, but none fully explains the scale of resilience. Even the most careful measurements cannot predict which trees will persist or which seedlings will falter, reinforcing the grove's enigmatic character. Tribal narratives describe the grove as a sacred place, long regarded as protected by unseen forces, where trees are said to endure through calamity that topples neighbouring stands. Oral histories recount elders teaching that the land itself possesses a form of guardianship, preserving pockets of life despite natural disasters. These stories do not contradict ecological observation, but add a layer of reverence, suggesting that human perception has long recognised the grove's unique properties. The intertwining of folklore and scientific study underscores the grove's dual identity as both a natural anomaly and a cultural touchstone. Birds perch confidently on precarious branches, and small mammals navigate the uneven terrain with astonishing ease, demonstrating that wildlife interacts with this grove differently than with the scarred slopes nearby. Insects swarm in clusters along moist moss, while amphibians and small rodents find shelter within crevices created by shifting boulders. The distribution of species suggests that the grove functions as an ecological refuge, offering conditions that neighbouring landslide-affected areas cannot support. Observers note that predation, movement and reproduction appear unaffected by instability, reinforcing the sense that life has adapted to this anomaly in ways that challenge expectation. Careful observation reveals that life here operates under a fragile balance, as if the grove itself dictates the rules of survival in defiance of natural expectation. Fallen debris and shifting soil threaten to undo the delicate lattice of roots, yet the forest persists, maintaining its structure even as external forces batter the scar above. Microclimatic effects, root networks, and protective formations all contribute, but the total effect cannot be quantified or predicted. Each visit reinforces the sense that the grove is both fragile and resilient, a living contradiction poised beneath ever-changing slopes. Amid the trembling slopes of Snoqualmie Pass, the grove remains steadfast, silently defying both gravity and expectation. The Ulse River Grove with the dead canopy. Above the forest floor, skeletal branches stretch like gnarled fingers, forming a canopy that is strangely lifeless while ferns and saplings below thrive in defiant green. The immediate contrast between decay and vitality is striking, creating a visual tension that unsettles even the most experienced naturalists. Light filters through the leafless upper branches, scattering across moss-covered rocks and wet soil, emphasizing the paradoxical vigor of life beneath apparent death. Twisted limbs reach in every direction, some broken or hollow, yet they remain suspended as though frozen in time. The quiet under the bare canopy amplifies every sound. A distant drip of water, the rustle of small mammals, or the subtle shift of loose soil. The air carries a metallic tang, mingling with the earthy aroma of decomposing wood, and moving through the grove evokes an odd awareness of both life and absence. Even in areas that appear most devastated, the forest floor hums with resilience, hinting at a hidden mechanism that preserves the grove in defiance of expectation. The Ulse River winds through dense conifers, yet this particular grove stands apart, its upper layers of trees decayed or dying in ways that contradict the surrounding old-growth vitality. In typical groves along the river, canopy trees tower in dense green, providing uniform shade and shelter for understory vegetation. Here, however, the skeletal roof leaves a lattice of sunlit and shadowed patches, creating microclimates unseen elsewhere. The dead canopy seems selective, with some species untouched while others appear reduced to fragile husks. Experts suggest disease, insect infestation, or climatic stress may play a role, yet no single factor explains the anomaly. The grove's isolation within the larger watershed enhances the effect, giving the area a quiet, uncanny presence where the forest seems suspended between life and decay. Patches of sunlight pierce gaps in the canopy, illuminating bare limbs and twisted branches, creating shadow patterns that seem almost deliberate in their irregularity. The interplay of light and darkness paints the grove in unsettling contrasts, sun-drenched ferns thriving beside areas of fallen bark and grey limbs. Moss clings to the underside of branches, forming bright green streaks across otherwise lifeless timber. Occasional birds flit among the branches, their movements highlighted by shafts of sunlight, adding to the sense that life persists in precarious balance. Observers often describe the visual effect as otherworldly, a stage set by nature itself where life and death coexist without resolution. Among the leafless upper branches, the understory bursts with mosses and young trees, forming a startling display of resilience against the apparent death above. Seedlings sprout in unexpected places, along fallen logs, in crevices of rocky outcrops, and between dense mats of decomposing needles. Fern fronds unfurl in soft, damp pockets, where the canopy allows filtered rain to nourish the soil. Even invasive plant species, typically suppressed by dense canopy shade, find opportunities to take root here. The understory thrives with such intensity that it seems to push upward toward the skeletal branches, an almost conscious response to the death looming above. Each step through the grove reinforces the impression that the forest is simultaneously fragile and tenacious. A cool, damp wind threads through the skeletal canopy, carrying the faint rustle of leaves from below while exposing the unsettling quiet of the lifeless upper limbs. At times, the wind channels through hollowed branches with a whistling resonance, echoing across gaps where limbs have fallen. Moisture hangs in the air, forming tiny droplets along the edges of moss, accentuating the forest's humid, almost breathing atmosphere. Even on calm days, subtle vibrations move through the trunks and roots, suggesting that the grove is alive in ways not immediately visible. The sensory experience here is layered. Visual paradox, tactile textures, and auditory anomalies converge to create a sense of being watched by the forest itself. Hikers and naturalists often remark on the contrast. Walking among vibrant undergrowth while staring at the empty grey expanse above evokes unease and a sense that the grove is observing silently. Footpaths, where they exist, wind cautiously through clusters of resilient ferns and scattered saplings, occasionally bringing travellers close to precarious areas of exposed roots and fallen branches. Despite careful footing, the impression remains that the canopy's emptiness is intentional, a deliberate signal of both fragility and warning. Some visitors report an almost physical tension in the air, a weight pressing down from the skeletal upper layer that is difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. Trees struggling to survive in the dead canopy display unusual growth patterns, with lower branches thickening and roots extending in ways that defy standard forest architecture. Roots twist across exposed soil, intertwining with fallen debris and creating a lattice that stabilizes the otherwise precarious grove. Trunks that might appear weak under normal circumstances maintain surprising rigidity, while saplings twist toward available sunlight with exaggerated curvature. The selective vigor of these trees suggests an adaptive response to persistent stress, yet the specific triggers remain unexplained. Each surviving tree seems to embody a strategy for enduring in a paradoxical environment where death and life coexist so closely. Soil composition and moisture distribution appear irregular. Scientists suggest fungi, pathogens, or microclimatic factors may contribute, though none fully explain the canopy's selective decline. Certain pockets retain high organic content, providing nourishment to resilient plants, while adjacent areas remain nearly sterile. Underground fungal networks intertwine with roots, possibly supporting growth in areas that would otherwise fail. Yet even detailed mapping of soil pH, nutrient content and moisture gradients cannot account for why the upper canopy decays selectively. The combination of factors creates a grove that challenges ecological expectations, raising questions about unknown forces at work in Pacific Northwest forests. Local folklore speaks of the whispering branches, tales describing spirits or unseen guardians inhabiting the upper dead canopy, preserving life below while forbidding intrusion above. Tribal stories recall that the grove has long been a site of reverence, where those who approach with respect encounter neither harm nor obstruction, yet those who act carelessly feel a palpable warning. Oral traditions suggest that the skeletal upper layer acts as both shield and sentinel, maintaining the grove's integrity while regulating interaction with the living forest beneath. Even modern researchers acknowledge that these stories, while unverifiable, capture the unease inspired by the grove's stark duality. Small mammals navigate the grove with heightened caution, nesting and foraging only where light and shelter intersect under the half-dead trees, responding instinctively to the canopy's paradox. Chipmunks dart across mossy roots, squirrels leap along fractured trunks, and deer occasionally pass through shaded understory corridors, all moving in patterns that reflect awareness of instability above. The distribution of these creatures appears concentrated in the most stable microzones, reinforcing the sense that life here is guided by subtle, unseen rules. Observation suggests that the grove imposes its own constraints on movement, shaping behaviour in ways that remain largely mysterious to humans. Careful study has yet to explain the grove's paradox. Life flourishes beneath decay, yet the dead upper branches remind all who enter of forces beyond human understanding. Ecologists can describe nutrient cycles, root entanglements and survival strategies, yet the total effect of these interacting systems continues to defy explanation. Each visit reveals new patterns of resilience, from saplings thriving in bare patches to mosses persisting in shadowed hollows, yet the overarching principle of survival remains concealed. In this way, the grove embodies a quiet, persistent mystery, where the coexistence of vitality and decay resists all attempts at comprehension. The Ulse River Grove rises quietly, its skeletal canopy guarding mysteries that no light has ever fully revealed. The Columbia Gorge Grove marked by stone arrangements. At first, it appears as nothing more than an out-of-place stone resting where erosion should have carried it away long ago. The surface is dulled by lichen, its edges smoothed by time rather than tools, and nothing about it immediately signals intention. Only after several steps does the impression begin to change as additional stones come into view, each one placed just far enough apart to avoid drawing attention, yet close enough to suggest relation. This is the Columbia Gorge Grove marked by stone arrangements, a quiet pocket of forest where the ground itself seems to hold a memory that refuses to scatter. Recognition follows slowly, as the eye begins to register alignment rather than coincidence within the grove, tucked into the Columbia River Gorge. Rocks lean towards one another at similar angles, some stacked no higher than a boot, others laid flat in elongated rows that subtly mirror the slope of the land. None of the stones is large or dramatic, and none resembles the conspicuous cairns often built by hikers. Instead, they appear intentionally modest, as if designed to remain unnoticed by anyone moving too quickly through the area. Scattered across the forest floor, stones form arrangements that resist casual explanation, their placement too deliberate to dismiss as chance. In places, 3 or 4 rocks create triangular forms. Elsewhere, single stones sit at measured distances, forming lines that extend until they dissolve into leaf litter and shadow. The spacing is inconsistent enough to avoid pattern recognition at a glance, yet consistent enough to feel governed by an underlying logic. It is this balance between order and irregularity that gives the grove its unsettling character. Lines, arcs, and clusters repeat at uneven intervals, creating a spatial rhythm that becomes more apparent the longer one remains still. The forest itself amplifies this effect, with moss-covered trunks and uneven ground limiting sightlines and forcing attention downward. As the hours pass, the arrangements seem to organize the space, subtly guiding movement through the grove in ways that feel unplanned, yet oddly constrained. Paths emerge that were never cut, defined only by where the stones seem to permit passage. This portion of the gorge is shaped by instability, where floods, landslides, and seasonal freeze-thaw cycles regularly reorder the ground itself. The Columbia River has a long history of catastrophic flooding, particularly during the Ice Age floods that scoured the gorge and rearranged entire landscapes. Even in modern times, gravity and water continue to reshape the terrain, making the long-term persistence of delicate stone arrangements deeply improbable. Any explanation must contend with the simple fact that the land here does not preserve fragile order easily. What unsettles observers most is not the presence of the stones, but the absence of any trace explaining who positioned them or why. There are no tool marks, no footprints preserved in the soil, no nearby campsites or signs of repeated visitation. The stones do not correspond to trail systems, property boundaries, or known recreational markers. Their restraint feels intentional, as though whoever placed them sought durability without visibility, permanence without recognition. Indigenous histories of the Columbia River region acknowledge stone as a meaningful medium, yet no specific tradition clearly accounts for this grove's arrangements. Archaeological research in the gorge documents fishing platforms, petroglyphs, and settlement sites, many of which were submerged or destroyed by dam construction along the river. However, these stone arrangements do not resemble documented cultural features, nor are they situated near known habitation zones. Their purpose, if cultural, remains disconnected from established frameworks of interpretation. Subtle changes have been noticed over time, where a stack appears newly adjusted, or an alignment seems extended without disturbance to its surroundings. Long-term observers describe returning to familiar formations only to find small deviations, an added stone, a slight rotation, a shift in spacing that feels intentional rather than incidental. These observations are difficult to verify, as the grove resists precise documentation. Photographs flatten perspective, and GPS mapping fails to capture relational nuance between stones. Prolonged exposure to the grove produces an unexpected mental shift, as ordered space begins to influence movement, attention, and decision-making. People report slowing their pace without conscious intent, choosing routes that feel permitted rather than efficient. The arrangements seem to encourage pause, inviting the mind to search for rules that never fully reveal themselves. Over time, the absence of explanation becomes more compelling than any single theory. Attempts to attribute the formations to natural sorting, recreational markers, or recent activity fail to account for their consistency and restraint. Natural processes tend to cluster stones by size or distribute them chaotically, but not maintain measured spacing across uneven terrain. Recreational cairns are usually conspicuous and transient, often dismantled as quickly as they are built. Here, the stones persist quietly, neither accumulating nor dispersing in ways that align with casual human presence. Rather than presenting itself as a relic, the grove gives the impression of continuity, as though its design remains quietly active. The arrangements do not dominate the landscape, yet they subtly reorganize perception, making absence feel deliberate and silence feel structured. Nothing in the grove announces danger, and nothing offers reassurance either. The longer one remains, the more the stones seem to insist that whatever shaped them is not finished. The stones do not ask to be interpreted, yet their careful persistence suggests a purpose that has neither concluded nor revealed itself. The Nehalem Valley Grove tied to early settler madness. Surviving settler correspondence from Oregon's northwestern interior contains an unsettling pattern of emotional strain that appears long before any mention of physical hardship or material loss. Letters sent eastward from the Nehalem Valley in the mid-19th century often open with ordinary descriptions of weather, land clearing and livestock concerns, yet they quickly drift toward expressions of unease that are difficult to trace to a single cause. The language becomes inward-focused, preoccupied with small disturbances, restless thoughts, and a sense of tension that settlers struggled to articulate. These early hints rarely name fear outright, but they establish an atmosphere of quiet instability that would deepen with time. Within these writings, the forested lowlands of the valley appear not as a backdrop, but as a presence that pressed continually on daily life. Life in the Nehalem Valley during early settlement demanded prolonged isolation, improvised labour systems, and a psychological endurance that many small communities struggled to sustain. Dense forests limited sightlines and sound travel, while seasonal flooding and persistent dampness restricted movement for months at a time. Settlers depended heavily on one another for survival, yet lived at distances that often prevented frequent contact. Under such conditions, stress and loneliness were expected, and historians have long acknowledged the mental toll of frontier life. What complicates the Nehalem Valley accounts is that similar pressures existed across Oregon's coastal ranges, yet only certain clusters of correspondence display the same gradual breakdown in clarity and coherence. Written accounts associated with this area begin to change in tone after extended residence, shifting toward repetition, fixation, and an unusual narrowing of attention that historians have struggled to contextualize. Entries linger on the same observations across weeks or months, returning repeatedly to familiar paths, identical sounds, or the sensation of being watched without evidence. Sentences grow longer and less structured, sometimes circling a single concern without resolution. This change does not coincide with famine, conflict, or disease outbreaks, suggesting that the cause lies elsewhere. The progression appears slow and cumulative, as though something in the environment encouraged inward collapse rather than outward crisis. Routine movement through one particular forested section of the valley appears repeatedly in these records, not as a destination of importance, but as a place settlers felt compelled to pass through again and again. The grove lies near natural travel routes connecting homesteads to river access points, making it unavoidable rather than remote. References describe entering it for mundane reasons, checking traps, cutting timber, moving supplies, yet the tone shifts noticeably when the grove is mentioned. Writers note altered perceptions of time, confusion over distance, and difficulty recalling how long they had been present. These remarks are brief and understated, but their recurrence across separate accounts lends them weight. What distinguishes these reports is not violence, disappearance, or overt hysteria, but a steady erosion of judgment and social cohesion that unfolded without a clear triggering event. Neighbours withdrew from communal efforts, small disputes escalated without obvious cause, and cooperation faltered where it had once been reliable. Letters mention mistrust without explanation, as well as an inability to articulate grievances clearly. Rather than dramatic breakdowns, the pattern suggests a quiet fragmentation of shared reality. The grove is never blamed directly, yet it appears repeatedly at the edges of these descriptions, present but unnamed as a source. Documentation linked to families who remained near the grove often ends abruptly, with journals left unfinished and letters stopping mid-thought rather than concluding with explanation or farewell. Some collections preserve only fragments, pages without dates, paragraphs trailing off, or margins filled with repeated words. There is no evidence of sudden catastrophe, fire, or forced relocation that might account for these interruptions. Instead, the silence feels voluntary, as though the act of writing itself became difficult to sustain. The absence of closure has drawn attention precisely because it defies the practical motivations that usually govern frontier correspondence. Environmental surveys and modern ecological assessments do not indicate that the grove itself differs in any measurable way from surrounding forest land. Tree composition, soil chemistry, and hydrology align closely with the broader Nehalem Valley ecosystem. There are no known toxic plants concentrated in the area, nor evidence of naturally occurring gases or mineral deposits that might impair cognition. Wildlife activity follows normal regional patterns, and no unusual acoustic or electromagnetic anomalies have been documented. From a scientific perspective, the grove appears unremarkable, a conclusion that deepens the uncertainty rather than resolving it. Neighbouring settlements operating under similar geographic and economic pressures did not exhibit the same pattern of psychological deterioration recorded near this site. Correspondence from adjacent valleys reflects hardship and occasional despair, yet maintains narrative clarity and continuity. Social structures persisted, disputes were resolved, and letters continued to serve their intended purpose of communication and record-keeping. The contrast suggests that isolation alone cannot account for the Nehalem Valley anomaly. Whatever influenced behaviour near the grove did not extend uniformly across the region, reinforcing the impression of a localised effect. Academic interpretations typically attribute these cases to frontier stress, seasonal confinement, and the mental toll of early isolation, though such explanations remain incomplete when applied consistently across the valley. Scholars note that psychological strain often manifests subtly, particularly in environments where survival demands suppress emotional expression. Yet the specificity of the grove's recurring presence challenges purely generalised explanations. The pattern does not align neatly with known stress responses, nor does it follow predictable timelines. Instead, it resists categorisation, lingering in the margins of historical analysis. Over time, the grove emerges in the historical record less as a place of danger and more as a threshold where ordinary routines quietly unravelled. It functioned as a passage rather than a destination, intersecting daily life in ways that settlers themselves seemed unable to articulate. Nothing dramatic occurred there that demanded documentation, and perhaps that is why it left such a subtle imprint. The absence of spectacle allowed its influence to go largely unchallenged, woven into habit rather than event. The grove endured as a silent constant while clarity eroded around it. No surviving account from those who stayed longest offers a reflective explanation, only an absence of closure that continues to resist interpretation. The historical record does not preserve a final realization or warning, only a gradual withdrawal from expression. In this way, the Nehalem Valley Grove remains defined not by what was recorded, but by what ceased to be written. Its legacy is one of diminishing voice rather than sudden tragedy, leaving modern readers to confront a mystery shaped as much by silence as by words. What lingers in the Nehalem Valley is not a story settlers told, but the shared moment when their words began to fail them. The Gifford Pinchot Grove where trails refused to stay aligned. Survey maps of the southern Washington Cascades have always carried an implied promise of stability, thin lines fixed to terrain that appears unmoving on paper, even when the ground itself is steep and volatile. In practice, however, certain sections of forest have resisted that promise for decades, forcing land managers to quietly revise expectations rather than explanations. Within Gifford Pinchot National Forest, where trails thread through volcanic ridges and dense conifer stands, there exists a grove where alignment itself seems provisional, as though the landscape refuses to accept human geometry for long. This grove lies within a managed forest named for Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the US Forest Service, an institution built on the idea that land could be measured, categorized, and sustainably controlled. The surrounding region is well studied, shaped by the Cascades' volcanic history and dominated by Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, and Mount Rainier, each of which has contributed layers of ash, lava, and debris over millennia. Yet despite this geological context, trail crews working near this specific stand have repeatedly documented discrepancies between mapped routes and the paths physically present on the ground. Records from a Forest Service maintenance logs show that certain trail segments in this area require reflagging and remeasuring far more often than comparable routes elsewhere in the forest. Switchbacks appear shortened or lengthened, junctions no longer align with posted distances, and familiar landmarks fail to correspond with their mapped positions. These inconsistencies are subtle enough to escape casual hikers, but significant enough to frustrate professionals trained to navigate by both map and terrain, particularly in a forest where GPS reception is already degraded by steep valleys and dense canopy. The usual explanations are practical ones. Volcanic soils shift easily under heavy rain, and the Gifford-Pinchot region receives substantial precipitation throughout the year. Landslides, erosion and fallen trees can alter a trail's course over time, and the Forest Service routinely reroutes paths to avoid damage or improve safety. What complicates matters in this grove is the absence of visible disturbance proportional to the changes recorded, with trail beds appearing intact even as their measured positions drift across successive surveys. Topographic comparisons spanning multiple decades show that the broader slopes remain stable, lacking the scar patterns typical of slow-moving landslides or creep. There are no recorded seismic events localized enough to account for repeated microshifts, and soil studies conducted elsewhere in the forest identify clear correlations between movement and composition that do not cleanly apply here. The ground feels firm underfoot, roots hold tightly, and the trees themselves show no sign of tilt or stress that would suggest gradual mass movement beneath them. What surveyors encounter instead is a creeping misalignment, a sense that reference points refuse to stay fixed. Trail markers placed using known bearings no longer correspond to earlier compass readings, even when magnetic interference from nearby rock formations has been ruled out. Some crews have noted that measurements taken days apart yield slightly different results despite identical methodology, a problem usually associated with human error but persistent enough here to become a quiet anomaly in internal reports. The forest history adds a layer of unease. Gifford-Pinchot National Forest contains landscapes reshaped by catastrophic events, most notably the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, which redefined ecological timelines and challenged recovery assumptions. That eruption produced massive debris flows and altered drainage systems across the region. Yet this grove sits outside the primary blast zone and shows no evidence of such trauma. Its trees are mature, its understory established, and its apparent stability only sharpens the contrast with its cartographic instability. Local trail workers, often seasonal employees familiar with the quirks of forest maintenance, tend to speak about the grove cautiously rather than dramatically. They describe needing extra time to reconcile maps with reality, or feeling disoriented despite clear weather and good visibility. Some mention the odd experience of walking a measured mile that feels noticeably longer or shorter than expected, a sensation difficult to quantify but repeated often enough to linger in memory. Navigation issues are not unheard of in dense forests, especially those with limited sightlines and uniform vegetation, yet this grove stands out because the confusion persists even with modern tools. Handheld GPS units show minor discrepancies between tracks recorded on the same route, and while such variance is common under canopy cover, the degree of inconsistency here exceeds what technicians typically attribute to signal error alone. When averaged out, the data suggests not randomness, but drift. Forest Service policy discourages attributing unexplained phenomena to anything beyond environmental factors, and official documents remain careful in their language. Still, the practical outcome is undeniable. Trails through this grove are checked more often, signage is adjusted more frequently, and maps are revised with unusual regularity. The forest absorbs these corrections quietly, without ever settling into the expected equilibrium of a managed landscape. For hikers unaware of this background, the grove feels no different at first glance. The trees rise straight and evenly spaced, moss clings to fallen logs, and the air carries the damp, resinous scent typical of the Cascades. It is only when distances fail to match expectations, when junctions appear earlier or later than planned, that a subtle unease sets in, a sense that the forest is not where it should be according to every reliable measure brought into it. Over time, the grove has earned a muted reputation among those who work the trails regularly, not as a place of danger, but as a place that resists being finalised. Each attempt to fix its paths in place seems temporary, as though the land itself is quietly revising the map after every human departure. leaving behind roots that exist but never quite agree to stay where they are drawn. The longer the grove is measured and corrected, the more it seems to suggest that its paths are not lost at all, but are deliberately refusing to remain where they are told to be. The Clayoquot Sound Grove, hidden by fog. Even on the clearest morning, the forest near Clayoquot Sound can suddenly disappear into a wall of grey, a grove where fog clings stubbornly to cedar and hemlock trunks as if reluctant to let anyone pass. Along the coast of Western Vancouver Island, the air is typically heavy with moisture, yet this particular stand maintains a near-permanent veil. Its presence is subtle on maps, but unmistakable to those who have entered. The forest feels separate from the surrounding landscape, insulated and unyielding, as though the fog itself is a living threshold, obscuring trails and bending perception. Seasonal patterns along Vancouver Island usually predict when mist will sweep the coast, carried inland from the Pacific or forming in sheltered valleys. Meteorological charts often show hours of sunlight over neighbouring forests, yet this grove defies expectation, holding its fog in place even under clear skies. Research conducted by Environment and Climate Change Canada notes that the region averages over 3,000 millimetres of rainfall annually, supporting dense temperate rainforest. But climatologists acknowledge that microclimates can create anomalies like this grove. Here, the fog refuses to obey the normal rhythm of weather, persisting long after surrounding valleys have brightened. Historical journals from early European settlers occasionally mention areas of unfading cloud, where sunlight seems swallowed before it can touch the forest floor. Indigenous oral histories similarly recount pockets of dense mist that never lift, often marking sites for ritual, warning, or respect. Archival material from the early 20th century references what surveyors termed persistent cloud zones, noting that travellers attempting to map these areas repeatedly misjudged distances and topography. The consistency of these accounts across decades and cultural perspectives adds weight to the grove's reputation as a place where ordinary observation yields unreliable results. Entering the grove, travellers note that familiar sounds, the snap of twigs, distant bird calls, even rushing water, become muffled, muted by layers of suspended moisture. Distances appear to stretch or compress beneath the grey veil, creating the disorienting impression of walking farther than one has or circling back unknowingly. Light filters unevenly through the canopy, breaking into muted green and silver shafts that illuminate moss-covered logs with an ethereal glow. Even seasoned hikers describe a sensation of subtle vertigo, as though the fog alters not only what is seen, but the very sense of space. Meteorologists explain fog in coastal temperate rainforest through well-understood mechanisms: condensation from temperature inversion, moisture-laden air from the Pacific, and radiational cooling overnight. Yet none of these processes entirely account for the grove's capacity to retain dense fog for hours or days when the surrounding terrain remains clear. Environmental monitoring equipment sometimes records air temperature and humidity comparable to nearby areas, yet the visual and tactile presence of fog persists only within the grove's confines. Scientists admit this microclimate remains partially unexplained, a natural puzzle resisting conventional classification. The perpetual damp nourishes an almost surreal proliferation of mosses, lichens and fungi, coating tree trunks and fallen logs in a carpet of vibrant green and silvery grey. This constant moisture creates spongy soil underfoot, softening steps and muffling sound further, deepening the sense of isolation. Epiphytic plants thrive in the diffused light, their fronds catching droplets that shimmer like suspended glass. The unusual density of these growths marks the grove as ecologically distinct, and botanists who have studied the area note that species composition differs slightly from neighbouring forests, suggesting the persistent fog shapes life itself. Those who navigate the grove for research or recreation often report an odd disorientation. Landmarks appear to shift subtly as visibility narrows, and even with GPS units or marked trails, wayfinding becomes challenging. Forest Service logs describe personnel needing additional time to complete field surveys, and hikers occasionally emerge from the fog near points they did not expect, creating frustration and unease. The grove seems to distort not the land itself, but perception, bending angles, muffling sounds, and obscuring familiar cues in a manner that defies easy explanation. indigenous knowledge provides context without explanation, describing zones of fog as places to be approached with caution. Oral traditions passed down through the Nuchanulth peoples speak of areas where spirits dwell, or ancestral presences linger beneath the mist, areas to respect and traverse only with mindfulness. While these accounts are cultural rather than scientific, they align closely with the observed behaviour of the grove. It holds humans at a distance, reshaping travel and observation without the use of barriers. The combination of natural persistence and cultural caution enhances the grove's aura of untouchability. Even satellite images struggle to capture the grove consistently. Aerial surveys from the Canadian Forest Service show intermittent clearing on certain days, only to find the area entirely shrouded in subsequent passes. High-resolution imagery often fails to penetrate the mist layer, and light detection technologies such as LiDAR register subtle anomalies in canopy height and density that are difficult to interpret. For scientists relying on remote observation, the grove resists documentation, a reminder that some landscapes cannot be fully observed without direct, on-the-ground experience. Expeditions into the grove frequently require repeated adjustments. A path that seemed visible in morning light can vanish in the afternoon, leaving workers or researchers to retrace steps or reroute in real time. The forest density and moisture contribute, but experienced observers note that fog can appear unpredictably, as if triggered by unseen currents or shifts in air pressure. Even brief departures from the centre of the grove can alter what is visible upon return, a phenomenon that frustrates attempts to survey or map the area and reinforces its enigmatic reputation. Ultimately, the grove resists categorization. Its boundaries are undefined, its atmosphere unwavering, and its persistence remarkable even among the well-studied rainforests of Vancouver Island. The fog acts simultaneously as a protector and a concealment, obscuring the forest while nurturing a unique ecology. Every visit reinforces the impression that human attempts at certainty, whether through maps, measurements, or observation, are incomplete here, and that the grove will continue to exist partially beyond comprehension, an anomaly quietly asserting itself within the broader landscape. The mist moves like a living tide, folding the forest into itself, and anyone who ventures beneath it leaves with the unsettling awareness that the grove knows more about them than they do about it. The Willamette Valley Grove with no animal life. Beneath a canopy of towering firs and maples in the Willamette Valley, a grove stretches wide and fertile, yet the usual chorus of wildlife is absent, leaving an unnatural stillness that presses on the senses. Sunlight filters through leaves in fractured beams, illuminating ferns, berry bushes, and mosses that carpet the forest floor with a vivid, almost surreal green. The air feels heavier here, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decomposing leaves, but none of the sounds expected in a temperate forest reach the ears. Footsteps echo strangely, amplified by the silence, and even the wind seems muted as it moves among the trees, as if the grove itself resists disturbance. The valley is renowned for its rich soils and temperate climate, conditions that normally support a remarkable diversity of mammals, birds, and amphibians. Deer roam freely among maple groves, woodpeckers drum on trunks, and countless insects maintain the pulse of the ecosystem. Yet, within this grove, none of these expected patterns emerge. Summer evenings that should be alive with songbird choruses or the chirp of crickets are instead defined by an almost total absence, and winter snow reveals no tracks of passing mammals. Even the occasional hawk circling overhead avoids lingering, gliding silently without descending. The contrast between the grove and its surroundings is stark, and it draws the attention of ecologists who struggle to reconcile the silence with the known fertility of the land. Survey reports and ecological studies consistently note the lack of animal activity. Oregon State University field surveys and Oregon Department of Forestry records have independently documented the anomaly, confirming that the absence persists across multiple seasons and years. Migratory birds pass overhead but fail to linger. Amphibians that thrive in nearby wetlands are scarce, and even the ubiquitous crows avoid the grove. The pattern is neither intermittent nor seasonal. It is a consistent emptiness, repeated across decades of observation. Researchers note that, in over 100 years of documentation, no known environmental shift has prompted the return of wildlife. deepening the grove's reputation as a place of silent defiance. Researchers and hikers alike describe an immediate sense of dislocation upon entering the grove. Even small movements, footsteps along leaf-littered trails, the rustle of foliage, are amplified, as if the forest is listening in the absence of other life. Birds do not respond to calls, and mammals that normally flee from human presence leave no sign of awareness. The air carries a chill in unexpected pockets, and occasional shifts in pressure make hair stand on end, while faint, unexplained scents, sweet, earthy, almost metallic, linger among the moss and ferns. The pervasive stillness heightens awareness of the surroundings. A snapping twig or a distant rustle seem sharper, more pronounced, while everything expected is conspicuously missing. The grove seems to enforce a boundary, an invisible rule of silence that unravels the familiar sensory cues of the forest. Streams and wetlands thread through the forest, supplying water to a dense array of plant species, including salmonberry, sword fern, and western red cedar. Berry bushes are abundant, understory shrubs are healthy, and canopy gaps allow enough sunlight for a robust ground layer. These conditions are typically ideal for small mammals, birds, and amphibians alike, offering both shelter and nourishment. Yet the fauna do not occupy these resources. Despite ample food and protective cover, animals appear absent, leaving the forest structurally complete but biologically empty, a paradox that ecologists find both fascinating and unnerving. Historical records show no recent logging, pesticide application, or large-scale human interference within the grove. Unlike surrounding farmland or previously logged tracts of forest, this patch has remained largely untouched, preserving soil integrity and canopy structure. Early survey maps from the late 19th century note the grove as strangely empty, and journals from travellers passing through remark upon its unusual quiet. Settlement maps indicate only occasional traversal by homesteaders, with no lasting modifications or constructions. The grove's preservation, combined with its silence, raises the question of whether the anomaly is natural or the result of a subtle and long-standing factor beyond typical human impact. Subtle variations in microclimate have been measured within the grove. Slightly cooler air pockets, high humidity, and uneven light filtering through dense canopy layers have been documented by field researchers. Dew collects earlier and lingers longer on mosses and leaves, and fog occasionally forms in the lower understory, even on otherwise clear mornings. While these conditions are well within the normal range for a temperate rainforest, they differ enough from nearby forest to suggest the grove maintains a distinct ecological envelope. The cumulative effect may contribute to its perceived stillness, yet no known environmental factor fully accounts for the total absence of animals. Instead, the grove exerts a sense of quiet that feels deliberate, as though the environment itself enforces a boundary against life. Scientists have explored potential explanations, including disease, soil chemistry anomalies, and trace chemical contaminants, but tests reveal nothing beyond normal ecological parameters. No pathogens that could account for widespread avoidance have been detected, and soil and water analyses return within expected ranges for nutrient-rich valley forests. Repeated testing for pesticide residues, heavy metals, and other environmental hazards has similarly failed to identify a cause. The consistency of these findings underscores the difficulty in explaining the phenomenon. The grove offers abundant resources, suitable habitat, and no detectable hazard, yet remains silent, an enigma that confounds conventional ecological reasoning. Observers conducting extended fieldwork report a uniformity to the silence that becomes increasingly disconcerting over time. Hours can pass without a single bird call, insect buzz, or rustle of a small mammal, and repeated visits across multiple seasons replicate the same outcome. Researchers conducting nighttime surveys note that nocturnal species, typically active in nearby forests, also avoid the grove entirely. Even experienced biologists accustomed to detecting subtle indicators of wildlife presence find themselves confronted with a void that resists interpretation. The sensory absence dominates perception, turning routine observation into an exercise in patience and unease, and leaving a lingering question of whether something unseen dictates the exclusion of life. In comparison to neighbouring forests as teeming with activity, the grove stands as a stark anomaly. Adjacent groves support black-tailed deer, raccoons, red foxes, and myriad bird species, demonstrating that regional ecosystems can sustain abundant life under similar conditions. The disparity heightens the sense of unnaturalness. reinforcing the impression that this grove operates under an invisible rule unknown to scientists and local inhabitants alike. Fertility and vegetation abound, yet the expected pulse of life is suspended, creating a paradox that challenges both observation and intuition. The paradox of the grove is undeniable. Every resource necessary to sustain life exists, yet life is absent. Canopy and understory, water and shelter all suggest habitability, but the forest remains devoid of mammals, birds and insects, as if enforcing a boundary invisible to all who enter. Sound is muted, movement is minimal, and human presence only accentuates the emptiness. The grove persists as a living contradiction, a fertile, undisturbed forest that refuses to fulfill the ecological expectations of its surroundings, maintaining an unsettling equilibrium between abundance and absence. The silence feels deliberate, almost watchful, leaving anyone who enters to wonder whether something unseen has claimed the grove long before they arrived. The Cascade Foothills Grove linked to vanished homesteads. The earliest records of settlement in the Cascade Foothills hint at ambition interrupted, with families filing claims, clearing plots and planting crops only to disappear within months, leaving cabins empty and tools abandoned. County ledgers note these abrupt departures with a stark, almost clinical detachment, yet the pattern repeats enough to suggest something beyond coincidence. Surveyors returning years later found the same plots untouched, garden beds overgrown, and fences collapsed under the weight of time, as if the grove actively resisted human presence. Letters from neighbours describe an eerie stillness around these sites, a quiet that unsettled even experienced homesteaders. Even in areas of fertile soil and accessible water, families vanished in ways that confounded local officials and historians alike. County land registers reveal a repeating pattern of homestead filings, followed by sudden erasure from official records, a sequence persisting across decades and waves of settlers. Maps from the late 1800s indicate plots claimed for timber and farming, but by the next federal survey many were marked as abandoned without annotation. Local newspapers occasionally noted missing families, tucked into back pages as brief reports of unexplained departures or houses left in sudden haste. The regularity of these occurrences, recurring over generations, suggests the grove exerted a subtle, unexplainable influence over those who attempted to inhabit it, resisting the permanence of human endeavour. Census enumerators occasionally found houses standing yet entirely unoccupied, with personal effects untouched, as if the inhabitants had vanished mid-activity. Plates remained on tables, chairs were positioned as though someone had just risen, and tools rested in order against walls. Enumerators meticulously recorded these details, noting the absence of footprints beyond the cleared area and the condition of doorways and windows as if the occupants had vanished instantly. No evidence suggested robbery, storm damage, or fire, nothing to account for such total abandonment. These frozen snapshots of daily life left investigators puzzled, creating the sense that time itself had fractured within the grove, freezing moments and erasing them. Settlers consistently selected similar locations within the grove: fertile soil, reliable water sources, and gentle slopes, yet even these ideal sites succumbed to inexplicable abandonment. Early homesteaders favoured clearings near streams, where fish and fresh water were abundant, and where sunlight reached the forest floor to nourish crops. Timber for construction was close at hand, and the surrounding forest provided shelter and resources. Despite these advantages, the same sites repeatedly failed to sustain settlement, leaving historians and ecologists questioning what force could render such promising land suddenly inhospitable. Evidence left behind is subtle but undeniable: stone foundations partially buried, remnants of garden plots overtaken by undergrowth, and wooden markers decayed beyond recognition. Moss-covered stones form rough perimeters where houses once stood, and in spring wildflowers bloom where gardens may have been tended a century ago. Occasionally, the faint smell of decaying wood mingles with the earthy scent of moss and leaves, as if the grove remembers its former occupants. Fallen branches, oddly arranged, suggest previous fencing or pathways, though time has obscured any clear pattern. The traces are tangible yet incomplete, evoking both presence and absence in a way that deepens the grove's enigmatic reputation. Surveyors' notebooks and Forest Service reports repeatedly describe homesteads suddenly vacated or disappeared without a trace, documenting the phenomenon in factual, verifiable terms. Officials noted that when returning to previously logged areas or claimed plots, structures were either gone or deteriorated beyond recognition in ways inconsistent with natural decay. Witness statements from residents, combined with these official records, confirm the historical reality of disappearances. Families and individuals once known to inhabit the grove simply ceased to exist in the archival record, leaving the land empty but not forgotten. Geological and soil surveys confirm that these abandoned plots offered the very resources necessary for successful farming, deepening the contradiction between environmental potential and human failure. Soil fertility tests show nutrient levels comparable to neighbouring areas that supported thriving homesteads for decades. Streams and springs provided a reliable source of fresh water, and natural slopes facilitated both drainage and crop cultivation. In short, the grove presented every condition necessary for successful settlement, yet every attempt ended abruptly, reinforcing the impression that something unaccountable governed the grove's history. Contemporary hikers and researchers sometimes discover foundations newly revealed after storms or paths that seem freshly cleared, suggesting the grove's memory of former settlement is not entirely dormant. Fallen trees occasionally expose outlines of former gardens or fences, and small depressions in the soil hint at cellars or storage pits. Footpaths appear where none existed before, connecting remnants in patterns that echo historic land surveys. In certain areas, wildlife avoids these old plots entirely, leaving a silence that draws attention to what should be ordinary forest activity. These occurrences maintain the sense of a place that reacts subtly to human presence, leaving observers unsettled and uneasy. Personal letters and diaries from early settlers hint at unexplainable disturbances, noises in the trees, missing supplies, and fleeting shadows that seem to follow families through their daily routines. Some writers describe doors left ajar when occupants returned, while others note livestock behaving strangely before vanishing. A few accounts mention odd lights or movement glimpsed at dusk, fleeting enough to evade verification but consistent across independent sources. These first-hand reports, corroborated by regional oral histories, suggest that the phenomenon was not simply a product of human error or hardship, but involved a persistent, mysterious interaction between the grove and its human inhabitants. Archaeological surveys using aerial imagery and GIS mapping reveal clusters of vanished homesteads that align with historical records, uncovering repeating spatial patterns that defy casual explanation. Certain plots, separated by precise distances or natural boundaries, were repeatedly chosen and abandoned, indicating that settlement patterns were influenced by the grove in ways not immediately obvious. Excavations confirm the consistency of artifacts and structural remnants across decades, pointing to a cyclical, almost deliberate pattern of habitation and disappearance that continues to elude explanation. Even modern mapping technologies struggle to reconcile the evidence with any conventional understanding of settlement patterns. Despite fertile soil, abundant water, and repeated human effort, the grove has consistently reclaimed its space, maintaining an enigmatic boundary between habitation and erasure that persists today. Families that once attempted life here are memorialized only in faded documents and faint traces of construction, leaving historians and ecologists alike to reconcile evidence of presence with the reality of absence. Every successive visitor, from early settlers to modern researchers, confronts the same tension. The land invites habitation, yet resists permanence, preserving a silent, unresolved narrative that stretches across generations. Even the most determined attempts at settlement fade swiftly, leaving only the silent impression that the grove keeps its secrets deliberately. The Deschutes National Forest Grove that repels fire crews. Firefighters and forest personnel have long spoken in hushed tones about a section of Deschutes National Forest where no team feels entirely secure, a grove where plans are disrupted and caution becomes instinct. Early wildfire reports noted hesitation when crews approached, often citing nothing more than anomalous conditions in their logs. Over the decades, a quiet reputation developed, a forested enclave where smoke behaves oddly, wind shifts unpredictably, and underbrush seems to reconfigure itself after being trampled. Even experienced personnel, accustomed to unpredictability in wildfire terrain, report a creeping unease, a subtle instinct to withdraw before completing assigned tasks. The grove, outwardly ordinary, exerts an unspoken authority over those who enter, leaving a lingering impression of unseen oversight. Official wildfire management records indicate that standard protocols, effective elsewhere, repeatedly falter when crews enter this particular area, creating both logistical and psychological challenges. Fire breaks cut through dense stands often fail to hold, and sprinkler deployments occasionally falter due to inexplicable drops in water pressure. Forest Service manuals, typically precise in their recommendations, offer no insight into these repeated failures. Comparisons with other forest sections reveal that this grove uniquely frustrates operation plans, a fact meticulously recorded over multiple decades. It is an anomaly within a highly studied ecosystem, a pocket of forest where documented procedures yield inconsistent outcomes. On multiple documented occasions, equipment malfunctioned without explanation, radios cutting out, GPS devices flickering and engines stalling, forcing teams to retreat before completing their assigned tasks. Incident reports describe crews unable to communicate with command posts, leaving them isolated in an environment that demands coordination and clarity. One declassified report recounts a sudden loss of directional sense among firefighters who found themselves retracing paths they had just navigated successfully. These recurring incidents, consistently verified across years of operations, created a growing mystique around the grove's boundaries and instilled a cautious respect among forest personnel. Patterns quickly emerged. The interference was localized, intense within the grove, yet absent in surrounding forest sections only a few hundred meters away, baffling both scientists and foresters. Meteorological studies accounted for typical wind shear and microclimate variation, yet could not explain the persistence or precision of the anomalies. Mapping overlays of incident reports and environmental conditions highlighted the grove as a consistent locus of irregularity, a point on the map that defied conventional prediction and operational expectation. The pattern reinforced the notion that this section of forest is fundamentally unlike its surroundings. Crew members describe a subtle unease that spreads quickly, an awareness of something unseen shifting among the trees, while the forest itself seems to resist their presence. Sounds that are usually familiar in smoke-choked forests, crackling underbrush, distant bird calls, snapping branches, often behave differently here. Footsteps echo oddly or fall silent, and animals seem absent or unusually wary. One veteran firefighter recalls pausing mid-step certain a presence was watching, though the grove yielded no tangible source of threat. These fleeting sensations are consistently reported, creating a heightened vigilance that leaves even seasoned professionals questioning what is natural and what is anomalous. Incident logs consistently employ terms like anomalous behavior and unexplained withdrawal, emphasizing the factual recording of events while simultaneously acknowledging the mystery. Entries describe crews abandoning equipment that functioned perfectly elsewhere, supplies found scattered in unusual patterns, and personnel reporting physical disorientation without any injury. The repetition of these terms across decades of documentation reflects a persistent disruption, creating a rare intersection of professional rigor and unexplainable phenomena. Analysts often highlight the unusually detailed nature of these logs, noting the precision with which anomalies are described despite their inexplicability. Environmental analyses reveal dense underbrush, irregular wind currents, and sudden microclimates, yet none of these factors alone fully accounts for the intensity of disruption reported. Soil composition, vegetation density, and topographical features were measured in repeated surveys, all aligning with regional norms. Even with these factors catalogued, crews reported equipment interference, lost directional sense, and heightened anxiety. While some variables partially explain minor complications, they cannot account for the persistent, highly localized anomalies experienced repeatedly within this grove. Comparisons with other fire-prone areas of the Pacific Northwest show a stark contrast. No other grove has produced comparable equipment failures, team disorientation, or repeated withdrawal incidents. Similar terrain, identical procedures, and even analogous weather patterns elsewhere fail to reproduce the disruption found here. Regional firefighting units began to refer informally to the grove as a place where nothing goes as planned, a label echoed in anecdotal reports, oral histories, and internal briefings. This informal consensus underscores the grove's exceptional character, recognized by multiple generations of forest personnel. Local anecdotal accounts reinforce the grove's reputation. Loggers, hikers, and park staff report erratic animal behaviour, disoriented navigation, and sudden, inexplicable cold pockets within its boundaries. Hunters noted game avoiding the area entirely, while hikers described dense fog appearing without warning and disappearing moments later. Rangers mentioned paths that seemed to shift subtly, confusing even GPS readings or physical markers. While these stories remain anecdotal, many intersect with documented operational reports, creating a layered record of both professional and civilian observations that strengthens the grove's enigmatic profile. Modern firefighting teams employ satellite imagery, GPS mapping, and pre-positioned resources to mitigate risk. Yet the grove's anomalous reputation persists, shaping decisions before a single footstep is taken inside. Contingency planning includes avoidance strategies and remote monitoring, yet direct intervention is minimized. Teams acknowledge that traditional mapping and predictive models often fail to fully account for the grove's irregularities, leading to a cautious respect for its influence. The combination of historical data, real-time observation, and professional experience reinforces the grove as a uniquely challenging environment. Years of careful observation, technological monitoring, and repeated attempts at intervention have proven insufficient, as the grove continues to assert an unyielding influence over every operation within its bounds. Even with improved training, communication systems, and equipment, crews report the same patterns of equipment failure, disorientation, and inexplicable withdrawal. Analysts studying the phenomena emphasize that the grove does not follow ordinary environmental or mechanical logic, yet remains fully tangible and identifiable on maps. The tension between observable fact and unexplained resistance is a defining characteristic of this forested enclave, a quiet anomaly in the broader wilderness of central Oregon. Within the Deschutes Grove, every attempt to assert control dissipates into uncertainty, leaving the persistent sense that the forest itself dictates which plans may survive. The Vancouver Island Grove with hollow echoes. Among the dense conifers of northern Vancouver Island, travellers report hollow tones that linger in the air long after their source should have dissipated, creating an unsettling symphony of sound. The forest itself seems to carry a resonance that defies immediate explanation, as though the earth, the trees, and the mist between them combine to produce vibrations that surpass ordinary perception. Even those accustomed to the acoustic variability of coastal forests describe a peculiar, almost deliberate quality to the echoes, as if the grove were aware of its visitors and responding in kind. Footsteps and voices bounce back at unexpected intervals, leaving the untrained ear struggling to separate reality from illusion, and in some accounts the echoes seem to interact with the rhythm of human movement. Massive Douglas firs and western red cedars dominate the grove, their thick trunks and towering canopies forming natural chambers that amplify vibrations in ways modern forestry studies struggle to explain. These trees, some exceeding a century in age, produce a density of wood and resin that can naturally reflect and resonate sound, yet the consistency and low-frequency characteristics observed here suggest an influence beyond simple physical architecture. Canopy layers trap and guide sound in subtle, unpredictable ways, creating pockets of reverberation that shift with each step. Mapping of trunk density, branch angles, and undergrowth composition consistently reveals patterns that align with the anomalous echoes, though correlations remain incomplete and leave researchers uncertain about the underlying mechanism. Forest rangers equipped with sensitive acoustic equipment have repeatedly recorded low-frequency oscillations, registering hums and reverberations even when wind and wildlife activity are minimal. Microphones and accelerometers placed across multiple zones within the grove capture subtle vibrations below the threshold of normal human hearing, sometimes producing a faint, vibrating sensation in the chest or head. While environmental conditions such as wind speed, temperature gradients, and humidity explain minor acoustic variations, the signals persist under controlled conditions, leaving researchers puzzled by their apparent independence from typical forest influences. In one study, vibrations were recorded continuously over several nights, revealing a rhythmic pattern that seemed to fluctuate independently of known environmental factors. Observations indicate the hollow echoes are most pronounced during transitional periods of day, just before dawn or as evening settles, with subtle environmental shifts seeming to influence their intensity. Temperatures drop slightly, wind patterns shift, and the moisture in the dense coastal air rises, creating a microclimate that appears to enhance resonance. Yet echoes recorded at the same times under similar conditions elsewhere on the island lack the same volume, tone, or persistence. Researchers suggest that the interplay between light, temperature, and forest structure may amplify sound in ways that are still poorly understood, producing a layered acoustic experience that seems almost intentional. Those entering the grove often experience a disorienting auditory effect, as if sounds are moving independently of physical sources, occasionally mimicking footsteps, distant calls, or whispers that vanish when approached. Loggers and hikers describe a sense of being followed by invisible movements, a tension created not by threat but by the forest's unidentifiable acoustic behaviour. Even experienced guides familiar with coastal sound propagation report moments of profound uncertainty, questioning the reliability of their senses. Some visitors note that echoes sometimes seem to anticipate their own actions, rising as a foot lifts or falling when attention wanders, creating a perceptual feedback loop that is difficult to reconcile with natural acoustics. Analyses using infrasound sensors confirm vibrations below the threshold of normal human hearing, producing physical sensations in the chest and head that are difficult to reconcile with standard acoustics. Researchers from nearby universities have attempted to model the grove's soundscape, incorporating tree density, soil composition, and canopy height, but the resulting simulations fail to reproduce the anomalies observed in the field. The vibrations remain detectable despite rigorous controls, highlighting the grove's ability to defy conventional explanation. Laboratory replication of similar conditions produces only faint echoes, underscoring the uniqueness of the site itself, while the in situ experience conveys a sense of scale and depth impossible to capture remotely. Underlying bedrock formations, a mixture of basalt and softer soils, may contribute to unusual resonance, yet these geological features fail to fully account for the precision and consistency of the echoes recorded. Surveys of the terrain indicate an irregular topography of subtle rises and depressions, potentially guiding sound in unpredictable ways. Soil density and moisture content create natural acoustic insulation, sometimes enhancing or muting the vibrations. Even with these factors measured and catalogued, the echoes maintain tonal qualities that appear purposeful rather than random, amplifying the sense that the grove is subtly alive with sound, as though responding selectively to human presence. Other Pacific Northwest forests produce occasional echoing effects, but the Vancouver Island Grove is remarkable for the clarity, volume, and apparent responsiveness of its soundscape. Coastal rainforests in Washington and British Columbia may generate echoes through dense vegetation or terrain, yet none demonstrate the combination of low-frequency resonance, temporal consistency, and perceptible physical effect that this grove exhibits. Comparative studies underscore the grove's singular status, emphasizing that while forests naturally manipulate sound, this grove does so in ways that resist conventional classification or prediction. Acoustic mapping confirms zones of amplification that cannot be replicated elsewhere, highlighting the site's unique sonic footprint. Indigenous oral histories reference forests that carry voices across distances, telling of trees that speak in tones humans can sometimes perceive, lending cultural depth to modern scientific observations. Local First Nations describe areas where the forest communicates through sound, warning of danger or guiding travellers, a notion that resonates with contemporary documentation of the hollow echoes. These oral traditions provide a historical continuity, suggesting that the acoustic phenomena observed today may have been noted and interpreted for generations, though modern instruments now quantify them in ways previously unimaginable. Visitors report that the echoes align eerily with these ancient accounts, as if past observation and present measurement converge in audible form. Teams of researchers experimenting with digital modelling, seismic sensors, and directional microphones continue to document the phenomena, yet the grove maintains an element of unpredictability that defies complete analysis. Equipment records show readings fluctuating even under controlled conditions, hinting at a complex interplay between physical, environmental, and possibly unrecognized biological factors. Attempts to artificially reproduce the echoes fail to capture the resonance's depth or spatial distribution, emphasizing that the grove's effect is site-specific and unlikely to be replicated elsewhere. Each investigation seems to reveal new layers of complexity, making the grove a living laboratory of sonic anomalies. The constant presence of unexplained vibrations fosters an uneasy fascination as listeners realise that each echo seems both tangible and deliberately elusive, resisting full comprehension. Those who spend extended time in the grove report a heightened awareness of space and sound, a wariness tempered by awe. Even when technology confirms the vibrations, their origin remains ambiguous, producing a tension between measurable reality and human perception. The grove's acoustic identity continues to challenge understanding, shaping both scientific inquiry and human experience, while a subtle energy seems to hover, as if the forest itself were attuned to those who enter its depths. Within this grove, the echoes appear to make choices of their own, revealing only fragments of a soundscape that might be listening back to those who enter. The Umpqua Forest Grove used for unrecorded burials. Shadows settle in an isolated corner of the Umpqua Forest, where whispers of long-forgotten graves seem to linger beneath the soil. The grove stretches across a low-lying ridge, its canopy dense with Sitka spruce, western hemlock, and scattered Douglas fir, creating a perpetual dimness even at midday. Travellers and researchers alike describe a palpable stillness, the kind that presses against the eardrums, muting ordinary forest sounds. The undergrowth is thick, a maze of ferns, moss, and fallen branches that obscures the terrain, leaving the ground itself as a canvas for secrets that refuse documentation. Even the air feels heavier here, saturated with the weight of untold human presence and the silent testimony of the forest. Maps from early surveys reveal fragmented settlements nearby, abandoned in ways that leave faint traces of human activity woven into the forest floor. Historical property records show plots claimed and then deserted, some returning to government hands, others disappearing from official records altogether. In the gaps between these parcels, the grove maintains a quiet authority, asserting itself over human attempts to control or occupy it. Abandoned homesteads once clustered near the edges of the forest appear in old photographs and survey notes, yet few structures remained intact long enough to leave substantial evidence. The seeming randomness of their disappearance amplifies the sense that the grove exerts an influence over its surroundings, shaping human history as silently as it shapes the landscape. Beneath the thick canopy, needles and moss form a dense carpet, softening sound and concealing the terrain in a way that invites speculation. Each step becomes a tentative negotiation with the ground, which shifts slightly underfoot as if testing those who tread upon it. Fallen logs, rotting stumps, and tangled roots create a natural camouflage, masking subtle undulations in the earth that could mark graves. The light that filters through the canopy is muted, scattering across the moss in irregular patterns, further obscuring small topographical variations. Even with careful measurement, the terrain resists easy interpretation, leaving both lay visitors and professionals uncertain where human influence begins and nature alone persists. Field teams consistently encounter subtle irregularities in the soil, areas of unusual compaction or root displacement that suggest unseen disturbances. Soil cores taken from various points reveal differences in density and moisture retention, hinting at long-term modifications, though definitive conclusions remain elusive. Some tree roots follow strange courses, arching over invisible obstacles, as though responding to voids buried beneath layers of detritus. Researchers note that these irregularities are isolated, appearing in clusters across the grove, and they do not correspond to natural water runoff, animal activity, or known geological formations. Each anomaly strengthens the sense that the grove preserves traces of human life carefully hidden by time and vegetation. Stories passed down by local indigenous communities describe sacred forest clearings, reserved for rituals and the interment of those no longer among the living. Oral histories recount that certain groves were intentionally left unmarked, sites where only the trees and the spirits of the departed bore witness. These accounts do not conflict with historical land surveys. Instead, they fill in the gaps left by official records, suggesting that human activity here operated outside documented oversight. Elders speak of the forest with reverence, describing it as attentive, responsive, and protective, a place where human remains could be laid to rest without drawing attention, ensuring both sanctity and secrecy. Small depressions and raised mounds appear unexpectedly, often detected only by careful observation of soil texture and vegetation patterns, In some cases, these features are only visible from certain angles, revealing themselves when sunlight strikes the forest floor at the right moment or when wind shifts a scattering of leaves. Hikers occasionally report stepping into depressions that feel unnaturally even, with subtle rises that seem almost sculpted. Stones, some moss-covered, cluster in patterns that evade explanation, neither purely natural nor obviously artificial. Collectively, these details create an impression of deliberate design, yet any attempt to fully map or quantify them remains frustratingly incomplete. Plants within the grove react in ways that defy typical ecological expectations. Ferns cluster unusually, saplings tilt without apparent cause, and moss spreads in concentrated, almost geometric patches. In some areas, ground cover appears unusually lush, while neighbouring soil remains barren, creating contrasts that hint at underlying disturbances. Scientists recognise that plant growth is sensitive to soil composition, moisture and sunlight, yet these irregular patterns do not correspond neatly with any measured environmental factor. The grove, in effect, behaves as though it carries a hidden memory, a biological record of events unseen and unrecorded by human eyes, preserved in the subtle choreography of vegetation across the forest floor. Scientific methods, including ground-penetrating radar and soil analysis, have uncovered ambiguous signals, hinting at the presence of voids or compacted layers without confirming graves. Readings fluctuate with minimal environmental changes, suggesting the anomalies are sensitive to factors not yet fully understood. Soil resistivity tests and subsurface scans occasionally detect linear or clustered features, yet repeated attempts yield inconsistent results. The forest's natural density, root systems, and accumulated organic matter complicate detection, creating a barrier to certainty even with advanced equipment. Each inconclusive measurement reinforces the grove's aura of secrecy, as if the very act of investigation encounters quiet resistance from the earth itself. A sense of weight hangs in the air, as if the forest itself holds a consciousness that is aware of every footstep and every disturbance. Silence is pervasive yet not absolute, punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, or the distant call of a bird, all magnified by the grove's intimacy and stillness. Observers describe a heightened awareness, a nervous attention to detail that feels almost necessary in order to navigate the forest without disturbing whatever history rests beneath it. The grove's atmosphere creates a tension between curiosity and caution, demanding careful movement while inspiring wonder at the unresolved stories hidden just beneath the surface. Researchers and visitors alike find their perceptions unsettled, unable to distinguish between natural anomalies and traces of past human activity. The line between observation and interpretation becomes increasingly subjective, as subtle variations in soil, stone, and vegetation suggest presence without providing proof. Even seasoned archaeologists note the sensation of being watched by absence itself, a weightless awareness that permeates the grove and challenges their scientific detachment. Every visit produces small, inexplicable details, shifted leaves, faint impressions, and patterns that seem intentional yet resist definitive analysis, contributing to a pervasive sense of mystery. The grove's dense foliage and subtle topography act as both shield and veil, preserving its secrets from casual observation while leaving faint traces for those who look closely. Moss-covered logs, hidden depressions, and unexpected soil compaction form a landscape that is as cryptic as it is undisturbed. While some anomalies may eventually be explained through geology or biology, the pattern as a whole suggests something beyond ordinary environmental processes, a deliberate, enduring imprint of human activity, obscured by both time and forest growth. The interplay of concealment and revelation gives the grove an almost sentient quality, a spatial memory that seems to archive histories only partially accessible to the living. The soil itself seems to remember lives long erased, holding secrets that the wind cannot carry and the forest cannot reveal. The Mount St. Helens Grove that shouldn't exist. Despite decades of volcanic devastation, a cluster of trees persists where models insisted nothing could survive, an ecological contradiction that continues to baffle scientists. This grove occupies a small portion of the Mount St. Helens blast zone, an area that in 1980 was swept clean by pyroclastic flows, lahars, and the lateral blast that flattened forests for miles. While surrounding regions exhibit the slow, patchwork recovery typical of volcanic landscapes, this grove's dense canopy and thriving understory suggest a persistence that defies expectation. Observers note the startling contrast between its vitality and the barren ash plains surrounding it, creating a sense of dislocation that is both beautiful and unnerving. The 1980 eruption transformed the region overnight, reducing entire ecosystems to ash, mud, and jagged rock, a raw tableau of destruction. More than 230 square miles of forest were obliterated, leaving snags, scorched soil, and debris fields where only scattered wildflowers and pioneer shrubs were expected to survive. Scientists predicted decades of incremental growth, limited by nutrient-poor ash and unpredictable microclimates. Yet the grove occupies a zone where the blast's force should have been near total, suggesting either a remarkable natural anomaly or an unaccounted protective feature that allowed certain life forms to endure against all odds. Ecologists expected only scattered pioneer species to appear over decades, yet this particular grove defied every prediction, stubbornly maintaining a continuity older than the surrounding regrowth. Tree cores indicate that some specimens predate the eruption, suggesting survival through extreme heat, forceful winds, and suffocating ash. The juxtaposition is unsettling, a living pocket persisting amid the remnants of destruction, like a fragment of history refusing to vanish. Researchers describe a tension between awe and incredulity when studying these surviving specimens, aware that conventional models cannot account for the grove's existence without leaving gaps in explanation. Examination reveals mature Douglas firs and western red cedars rooted in compacted ash, their survival a testament to microclimates and subtle environmental shielding. Soil in these pockets is slightly richer, with trapped moisture and decomposing organic matter that escaped the blast, offering a foothold for life to persist. Lichen and moss cling to bark and fallen logs in unusually thick layers, suggesting continuous growth despite decades of exposure. The physical resilience of these trees is evident in the thickened bark, reinforced root systems, and unusually low mortality rates compared to similar post-eruption stands, hinting at natural adaptations or hidden protective conditions yet fully understood. Early aerial surveys, including photographs by Bradford Washburn, documented anomalies, clusters of intact trees embedded within what was otherwise complete devastation. From above, these groves appeared as dark islands amidst a grey, lifeless sea strikingly out of place. Subsequent ground surveys confirmed these anomalies, measuring both mature trees and saplings thriving where no soil or shelter seemed sufficient. Researchers were initially skeptical, questioning the accuracy of aerial interpretation, but repeated observation and documentation left little room for doubt. The grove's persistence became an enduring question in ecological literature, cited in studies of resilience and survival in extreme environments. Soil composition varies within the grove, with isolated pockets retaining moisture and nutrients, creating survival zones invisible to casual observation. Microtopographical features, such as depressions and rocky outcrops, act as shields from wind and ash accumulation, allowing roots to anchor more securely. Organic matter, though sparse, is concentrated in irregular patches, promoting seedling establishment and sapling growth. Temperature measurements within these microhabitats often differ by several degrees from the surrounding ash flats, suggesting subtle thermal protection. These conditions combined create a natural sanctuary that supports life where conventional expectations predicted only barrenness. Saplings appear in irregular patterns, often growing adjacent to pre-eruption trees, suggesting continuity rather than new colonization. Some trees lean at improbable angles, their growth shaped by blast debris rather than sunlight alone. Others show multiple growth points, sprouting from roots or stumps that survived the eruption. The arrangement of these saplings appears semi-random yet persistent, reflecting ecological processes influenced by both catastrophic events and ongoing adaptation. Observers note that even the smallest plants seem unusually robust, further reinforcing the grove's anomalous character and its resistance to the environmental extremes of the blast zone. Researchers traversing the blast zone speak of a palpable difference upon entering the grove, where the air feels heavier with resilience and the ground subtly supportive of life. Sounds are altered, with footsteps muffled by soft moss and fallen needles, creating an almost surreal quiet. The grove emits a distinct presence, a combination of verdant growth, subtle moisture, and the faint, clean scent of living vegetation contrasted against the surrounding ash. Scientists describe a sense of temporal dissonance, as though this living pocket exists in a slightly different rhythm from the devastated landscape around it. Theories abound: seed dispersal, subterranean refuges, microclimate pockets, but no single explanation fully accounts for the grove's density and age distribution. Birds may have carried seeds, yet the continuity of mature trees suggests survival rather than recolonization. Underground root systems may have buffered smaller plants from thermal extremes, but such mechanisms do not explain why some trees survived intact while neighbouring ones perished. Even the combination of multiple natural factors leaves gaps in understanding, contributing to the grove's aura of mystery and reinforcing its status as an ecological anomaly. Sounds seem muted yet amplified, as if the grove operates on a rhythm distinct from the surrounding wasteland, a subtle resonance of persistence. Wind through the upper branches produces faint harmonic tones, amplified by the configuration of surviving tree trunks. Birdsong, though sparse, carries differently here, echoing with a clarity absent in the barren ash flats. The human experience of the grove is equally enigmatic. Time appears to pass differently, perception sharpens, and subtle details command attention, producing an almost meditative state in which the mind measures survival against destruction. Every measured variable defies expectation. Tree growth, soil quality, and biodiversity suggest a process at work that science observes but cannot yet fully articulate. Detailed botanical surveys, repeated soil analyses, and aerial imaging all reinforce the notion that this grove functions as a natural anomaly, a small ecosystem surviving in defiance of catastrophic history. Its persistence challenges assumptions about the speed and mechanisms of ecological recovery and raises profound questions about the limits of scientific prediction when faced with complex, chaotic natural events. The grove stands as both a subject of study and a quiet reminder of nature's unpredictability. In the middle of the ashen ruin, life endures with a quiet certainty, hinting at mysteries that remain just beyond human understanding. The Klamath Siskiyou Grove, where trees grow backward. A forest in the Klamath Siskiyou region conceals trees that curve and twist against every expectation, as if responding to an unseen force. At first glance, the grove appears unremarkable, a typical segment of the Pacific Northwest's rugged woodland, yet closer observation reveals an unsettling irregularity. Trunks bend in impossible angles, limbs stretch backward rather than towards sunlight, and the usual logic of vertical growth seems suspended. Ecologists who first documented these anomalies were confounded, noting that the tree's structures did not align with prevailing theories of phototropism or wind adaptation. Each visit reinforces the impression that this grove is not simply unusual, it is defiant of known natural laws. The surrounding terrain, a tangle of ridges, valleys, and microclimates, already defies simple classification, yet this grove stands out for reasons scientists cannot fully explain. The Klamath Siskiyou region is renowned for its botanical diversity, home to hundreds of species, including rare conifers and endemic shrubs. Elevation changes, rocky outcrops, and streams create pockets of isolated ecosystems, but none match the extreme directional deviation found in this grove. Satellite imagery and topographic maps indicate slight depressions and slopes, yet the degree of inversion observed among mature trees exceeds anything measurable by soil, light, or gradient alone. Decades of botanical surveys recorded irregular growth among multiple species, revealing branches and trunks extending in directions counter to sunlight and gravity. Early field notes mention astonishment at the precision and repetition of the reversed growth, suggesting a systemic rather than random phenomenon. Researchers carefully catalogued each tree, measuring angles, heights, and curvature, only to find consistent patterns of backward extension that repeated across hundreds of specimens. These records, cross-referenced with species identification and age estimates, provide undeniable evidence that the anomaly is widespread and persistent. Douglas firs and ponderosa pines rise in arcs that seem inverted, their limbs bending backward while their roots cling to the thin, rocky soil with unusual tenacity. The curvature is subtle at first, barely noticeable to the casual observer, but becomes striking when comparing trees side by side. Younger trees mimic the older forms, almost as though they are copying a template, yet each maintains slight variations, preventing easy classification. Some trunks appear to spiral upward before abruptly reversing course, a growth pattern that has left dendrologists puzzled and prompted questions about genetic mutations, environmental triggers, or unseen forces influencing development. Examinations of soil, moisture retention, and slope fail to account for the degree of reversal observed, leaving researchers to speculate on subtle environmental influences. Tests reveal only minor variations in nutrient concentration or pH levels, none sufficient to produce such systematic deviation. In some areas, compacted soil or shallow bedrock seems to guide root systems in unexpected ways, yet the tree's angles persist even where conditions are uniform. Detailed measurements of wind patterns and sunlight exposure also fail to correlate consistently with the observed orientation, further highlighting the grove's resistance to conventional explanation. Field teams repeatedly encounter measurement anomalies, as conventional forestry tools cannot fully capture the intricate curves and lean angles of the grove's trees. Clinometers, tapes, and laser rangefinders yield inconsistent readings, often forcing teams to adjust their methodology or rely on repeated observations. The physical irregularities of the grove make mapping challenging, producing sketches and diagrams that defy standard logic. Even seasoned dendrologists report a sense of frustration and awe, as the forest seems determined to evade precise scientific documentation, a living puzzle that resists being neatly categorized. Light filters through the contorted canopy in unpredictable ways, casting shifting shadows that obscure orientation and warp perception of depth. Sunlight strikes branches from unusual angles, illuminating the undersides of leaves typically hidden, creating a visual effect that disorients the eye. In early morning or late afternoon, the grove can appear almost inverted, with shadows stretching opposite to the apparent source of light. Researchers note that these visual inconsistencies are amplified by the irregular spacing and curvature of trees, further enhancing the sense that this grove exists under its own internal logic, separate from the surrounding environment. Sounds behave strangely within the grove. Wind and small animal noises echo unusually, giving the impression that the space itself is slightly off-kilter. A branch scraping another can sound magnified, while footsteps on moss and leaf litter produce faint delayed reverberations. Even birdsong carries differently, with echoes bouncing along the twisted trunks and creating subtle harmonic distortions. Field biologists remark that these auditory phenomena are not constant, but fluctuate depending on position, weather, and time of day, suggesting that the grove's configuration actively shapes sound in ways still not fully understood. Scientists have proposed explanations ranging from rare genetic variants to the lingering effects of past seismic activity, though none conclusively explain the scale of the phenomenon. Some suggest that soil stress or localized mineral content may subtly redirect growth, while others theorize that microearthquakes or shifts in bedrock could influence root direction. Genetic studies reveal minor variations in DNA among the grove's conifers, hinting at potential adaptations, yet these do not account for the uniform backward curvature observed across species and age classes. The lack of a single comprehensive explanation leaves the grove suspended between science and speculation. The forest floor slopes subtly, yet the tilted trees create the sensation that gravity itself bends differently here, prompting unease in even experienced ecologists. Navigating between the contorted trunks produces an uncanny sense of imbalance, a visual and physical paradox where forward movement sometimes feels lateral. Moss and ferns cling to unusual surfaces, further complicating orientation. Researchers describe a mild vertigo and heightened alertness within the grove, a sensory dissonance that fades only after leaving the anomalous area. These perceptual oddities reinforce the grove's reputation as more than a botanical curiosity, hinting at a deeper unexplained characteristic of the space itself. Each investigation deepens the mystery, revealing a grove that seems to operate under its own rules, resisting conventional understanding of growth and form. Detailed surveys, repeated measurements, and decades of observation all converge on the same conclusion. The backward growth is consistent, deliberate in appearance, and widespread across species and age ranges. The grove functions as both laboratory and enigma, simultaneously teaching and frustrating those who study it. Ecologists acknowledge that while much can be documented, the underlying cause may remain elusive, a natural anomaly that defies tidy classification. Among these backward-reaching trunks, it becomes clear that the forest guards secrets no human measurement can fully uncover. The Puget Sound Grove that locals refuse to name. In the heart of Puget Sound lies a grove that most locals refuse to name, a woodland passed through generations as a space to be avoided. At first glance, it appears like any other temperate forest, a mix of Douglas firs, western red cedars, and moss-covered undergrowth. Yet for reasons that resist simple explanation, the grove carries a reputation unlike any other in the region. Residents speak in whispers or avoid the subject entirely, offering vague warnings that hint at unseen rules and unspoken histories. The secrecy surrounding the grove has persisted for decades, embedding it in local consciousness as a place to approach only with caution, if at all. Despite its proximity to towns and roadways, the area remains concealed within undulating terrain, accessible only through faint, rarely used paths. Satellite imagery shows patches of dense canopy and uneven clearings, yet field explorers often report difficulty locating the grove precisely, even with GPS assistance. Several minor streams and marshy sections surround the forest, adding natural barriers that have discouraged casual exploration. Even modern maps tend to treat it as an unremarkable green patch, its significance diminished to blank space, an omission that has only fueled curiosity among those who study the region. Historical surveys and property maps reference the forest sporadically, though records are often inconsistent or deliberately vague. Early 20th century logging permits occasionally skirted the grove, with notations like unclassified wooded area or avoidance recommended, though the reasons remain unexplained. Topographic sheets from the 1930s indicate irregular boundaries, and anecdotal accounts suggest surveyors were sometimes disoriented or turned away by locals before completing documentation. These inconsistencies have persisted, leaving gaps in official records that render the grove almost invisible to formal study, while simultaneously heightening its air of mystery. Longtime residents recount stories warning of misfortune or disorientation, passing advice to outsiders in hushed tones while deliberately leaving the grove unnamed. Some describe ancestors who refuse to approach it under any circumstances, claiming subtle but unmistakable sensations of unease. In several accounts, the forest is associated with paths that vanish, brief glimpses of movement beyond sight, or an overwhelming instinct to retreat. Folklorists note that such warnings, often lacking concrete explanation, suggest a strong cultural tradition of avoidance, reinforced over decades through repetition and generational respect for the unspoken. Vegetation within the grove appears ordinary at first glance, dense evergreens and thick moss carpeting the forest floor in patterns familiar throughout the Puget Sound region. There are no obvious botanical anomalies, no bent trees or inverted growth, no rare or exotic species to account for attention. Yet despite the absence of overt peculiarity, the grove carries a peculiar stillness, an almost unnatural calm that seems to accentuate even the faintest sound. Footsteps fall softly, wind whispers lightly through branches, and birdsong is sparse, as if the forest life itself respects the unwritten boundaries imposed by local superstition. Investigators who venture close report an odd awareness, a sense of being watched or guided back along the wrong path, though no human presence is evident. Hikers attempting to explore deeper often describe disorientation, mistaking distances and directions despite clear landmarks. Several documented expeditions noted that compasses and GPS devices occasionally acted erratically, further reinforcing a sense of spatial confusion. Journalists and naturalists who approached the grove for research consistently remarked on the subtle pressure to turn back, a sensation that defies rational explanation and leaves even the most experienced explorers uneasy. Trails leading near the grove often curve away inexplicably, and even seasoned hikers instinctively alter their route. Footpaths that appear on older maps no longer exist in any discernible form, overgrown or rerouted by natural growth. Local law suggests that people who ignore these deviations encounter minor accidents, vanish briefly, or feel compelled to retrace their steps, creating a social pattern of avoidance. These behaviours, observed repeatedly over decades, suggest that the mystery is reinforced not just by natural features, but by human perception and caution, the subtle social contract shaping interaction with the forest. Government forestry records contain curious omissions. While surrounding forests are meticulously documented, this particular area is often absent or inconsistently categorized. Logs from the Department of Natural Resources note the grove's vicinity but rarely provide precise measurements or species lists. Some entries include cautionary annotations, though officials declined to elaborate, and subsequent surveys avoided the forest entirely. Scholars examining regional land records and environmental studies note that the combination of bureaucratic ambiguity and local silence renders the grove virtually invisible in formal documentation, an anomaly that preserves its secrecy. Those who linger nearby describe fleeting movements at the periphery, whispers carried by wind, and a compulsion to retreat despite no apparent danger. Wildlife, while present, seems unusually cautious, retreating quickly and leaving small clearings silent. Travellers report that shadows seem to shift unnaturally, and even familiar sounds feel subtly distorted. The human response is consistent: a rising unease, a subtle tightening of focus, and often a sudden, unarticulated decision to depart. These phenomena suggest that the grove exerts influence not through visible or physical anomaly, but through psychological and sensory effects that are difficult to quantify. Scholars and folklorists speculate on potential origins, forgotten settlements, natural hazards, historical taboos, or ecological peculiarities may have influenced the enduring avoidance. One theory posits that early settlers may have experienced unexplained disappearances or misfortune, imprinting caution into local consciousness. Another suggests that the grove's subtle ecological features, like microclimates or hidden wetlands, could have produced instinctual wariness over time. While none of these explanations is conclusive, the convergence of historical records, local testimony, and sensory observation maintains the grove's reputation as uniquely enigmatic. A weight of unspoken expectation hangs over the area, as if generations of avoidance have infused the soil and air with an invisible authority that guides every step. Even researchers unconnected to local legends sense it. The grove communicates through absence, through subtle cues and unnameable tension. It is a forest defined not by physical anomalies, but by human perception and collective caution, a place where silence, respect, and mystery are inseparable. Every visit reinforces that the grove's significance lies less in what is present than in what is consciously avoided, a paradox of engagement and restraint that defies explanation. In this unnamed forest, the quiet is deliberate, and the refusal to speak its name may be the most profound warning of all.